Chapter 10, The Maid, Sword, and Banner. Joan's first official act was to dictate a letter to the English commanders at Orleans, summoning them to deliver up all strongholds in their possession and depart out of France. She must have been thinking it all out before and arranging it in her mind. It flowed from her lips so smoothly, and framed itself into such vivacious and forcible language. Still, it might not have been so. She always had a quick mind and a capable tongue, and her faculties were constantly developing in these latter weeks. This letter was to be forwarded presently from Blois. Men, provisions, and money were offering in plenty now, and Joan appointed Blois as a recruiting station and depot of supplies, and ordered up La Hire from the front to take charge. The great bastard, him of the ducal house, and governor of Orleans, had been clamoring for weeks for Joan to be sent to him, and now came another messenger, old Dolan, a veteran officer, a trusty man and fine and honest. The king kept him, and gave him to Joan to be chief of her household, and commanded her to appoint the rest of her people herself, making their number and dignity accord with the greatness of her office. And at the same time he gave order that they should be properly equipped with arms, clothing, and horses. Meantime the king was having a complete suit of armor made for her at Tours. It was of the finest steel, heavily plated with silver, richly ornamented with engraved designs, and polished like a mirror. Joan's voices had told her that there was an ancient sword hidden somewhere behind the altar of St. Catherine's at Fibrois, and she sent the Mets to get it. The priest knew of no such sword, but a search was made, and sure enough it was found in that place, buried a little way under the ground. It had no sheath and was very rusty, but the priest polished it up and sent it to Tours, whither we were now to come. They also had a sheath of crimson velvet made for it, and the people of Tours equipped it with another, made of cloth of gold. But Joan meant to carry the sword always in battle, so she laid the showy sheaths away and got one made of leather. It was generally believed that this sword had belonged to Charlemagne, but that was only a matter of opinion. I wanted to sharpen that old blade, but she said it was not necessary, as she should never kill anybody, and should carry it only as a symbol of authority. At Tours she designed her standard, and a Scotch painter named James Power made it. It was of the most delicate white boucassin, with fringes of silk. For device it bore the image of God the Father throned in the clouds and holding the world in his hand. 2 angels knelt at his feet, presenting lilies. Inscription, Jesus, Maria. On the reverse, a crown of France supported by 2 angels. She also caused a smaller standard or pennon to be made, whereon was represented an angel offering a lily to the Holy Virgin. Around Joan's headquarters a crowd of people was always massed, hoping for a glimpse of the new general, and when they got it, they went wild. But they seldom got it, for she was busy planning her campaign, receiving reports, giving orders, dispatching couriers, and giving what odd moments she could spare to the companies of great folk waiting in the drawing rooms. As for us boys, we hardly saw her at all, she was so occupied. We were in a mixed state of mind, sometimes hopeful, sometimes not, mostly not. She had not appointed her household yet. That was our trouble. We knew she was being overrun with applications for places in it, and that these applications were backed by great names and weighty influence, whereas we had nothing of the sort to recommend us. She could fill her humblest places with titled folk whose relationships would be a bulwark for her and a valuable support at all times. In these circumstances, would policy allow her to consider us? We were not as cheerful as the rest of the town, but were inclined to be depressed and worried. Sometimes we discussed our slim chances and gave them as good an appearance as we could. But the very mention of the subject was anguish to the paladin, for whereas we had some little hope, he had none at all. As a rule, Noel Rain-Gesson was quite willing to let the dismal matter alone, but not when the paladin was present. Once we were talking the thing over, when Noel said, "Cheer up, paladin. I had a dream last night, and you were the only one among us that got an appointment. It wasn't a high one, but it was an appointment anyway, some kind of a lackey or body servant, or something of that kind." The paladin roused up and looked almost cheerful, for he was a believer in dreams, and in anything and everything of a superstitious sort. In fact, he said, with a rising hopefulness, "Certainly, I might almost say I know it will, for my dreams hardly ever fail. No, I could argue if that dream could come true. I could, indeed. to be servant of the first general of France and have all the world hear of it. And the news go back to the village and make those gawks stay that always said I wouldn't ever amount to anything. Wouldn't it be great? Do you think it will come true? No? Don't you believe it will? I do. There's my hand on it. Noel, if it comes true, I'll never forget you. Shake again. I should be dressed in a noble livery, and the news would go to the village, and those animals would say, him, lackey to the general-in-chief, with the eyes of the whole world on him, admiring. Well, he has shot up into the sky now, hasn't he? He began to walk the floor and pile castles in the air so fast and so high that we could hardly keep up with him. Then all of a sudden all the joy went out of his face and misery took its place, and he said, "Oh, Day, it is all a mistake. It will never come true. I forgot that foolish business at Toul. I have kept out of her sight as much as I could all these weeks, hoping she would forget that and forgive it. But I know she never will. She can't, of course. And, after all, I wasn't to blame. I did say she promised to marry me, but they put me up to it and persuaded me. I swear they did." The vast creature was almost crying. Then he pulled himself together and said, remorsefully, "It was the only lie I've ever told, and—" He was drowned out with a chorus of groans and outraged exclamations, and before he could begin again, one of Deolin's liveried servants appeared and said we were required at headquarters. We rose, and Noel said. But the paladin was afraid to go, so we left him, when we presently stood in the presence. In front of a crowd of glittering officers of the army, Joan greeted us with a winning smile, and said she appointed all of us to places in her household, for she wanted her old friends by her. It was a beautiful surprise to have ourselves honored like this when she could have had people of birth and consequence instead. But we couldn't find our tongues to say so. She was become so great and so high above us now. "But where's the paladin?" The Sieur Bertrand said. "He thought he was not sent for, Your Excellency." The paladin entered humbly enough. He ventured no farther than just within the door. He stopped there, looking embarrassed and afraid. Then Joan spoke pleasantly and said, "Into the fire," he said, and I said to myself, "By the ring of that, I think she has turned this braggart into a hero. It is another of her miracles, I make no doubt of it." He took the banner, which is now the most precious of the memorials that remain of Joan of Arc, and his voice was unsteady with emotion when he said, "If I ever disgrace this trust, my comrades here will know how to do a friend's office upon my body, and this charge I lay upon them, as knowing they will not fail me." Chapter 11, the war march, is begun. Noel and I went back together, silent at first and impressed. Finally Noel came up out of his thinkings and said, "The first shall be last and the last first. There's authority for this surprise. But at the same time, wasn't it a lofty hoist for our big bull?" It truly was. I'm not over being stunned yet. It was the greatest place in her gift. Yes, it was. There are many generals, and she can create more, but there is only one standard bearer. True, it is the most conspicuous place in the army, after her own, and the most coveted and honorable. Sons of two dukes tried to get it, as we know, and of all people in the world, this majestic windmill carries it off. Well, isn't it a gigantic promotion when you come to look at it? Yes, without any trouble at all. That is, I think I do. Noel was surprised at that, and glanced up quickly, as if to see if I was in earnest. He said, "I thought you couldn't be in earnest, but I see you are. If you can make me understand this puzzle, do it. Tell me what the explanation is." "I believe I can. You have noticed that our chief knight says a good many wise things and has a thoughtful head on his shoulders. One day, riding along, we were talking about Joan's great talents, and he said, 'But greatest of all her gifts, she has the seeing eye.' I said, like an unthinking fool, 'The seeing eye? I shouldn't count on that for much. I suppose we all have it.' 'No,' he said, 'very few have it.' Then he explained and made his meaning clear. He said the common eye sees only the outside of things and judges by that, But the seeing eye pierces through and reads the heart and the soul, finding their capacities which the outside didn't indicate or promise, and which the other kind of eye couldn't detect. When I dined with the governor of Vaucouleurs so long ago, I saw nothing in our 2 nights, though I sat with them and talked with them 2 hours. Joan was there 5 minutes, and neither spoke with them nor heard them speak, yet she marked them for men of worth and fidelity, and they had confirmed her judgment. Whom has she sent for to take charge of this thundering rebel of new recruits at Boal, made up of old disbanded Armagnac raiders, unspeakable hellions, everyone? Why, she has sent for Satan himself, that is to say, La Hire, that military hurricane, that godless swashbuckler, that lurid conflagration of blasphemy, that Vesuvius of profanity, forever in eruption. Does he know how to deal with that mob of roaring devils? I, too. His name stirs me just as it did when I was a little boy. I want to hear him swear. Which brings us back to where we started. I have an honest affection for the paladin, and not merely because he is a good fellow, but because he is my child. I made him what he is, the windiest blusterer and most Catholic liar in the kingdom. I'm glad of his luck, but I hadn't the seeing eye. I shouldn't have chosen him for the most dangerous post in the army. I should have placed him in the rear to kill the wounded and violate the dead. Well, we shall see. Joan probably knows what is in him better than we do. And I'll give you another idea. When a person in Joan of Arc's position tells a man he is brave, he believes it, and believing it is enough. In fact, to believe yourself brave is to be brave. It is the one only essential thing. I was summoned now to write a letter from Joan's dictation. During the next day and night hours, several uniforms were made by the tailors, and our new armor provided. We were beautiful to look upon now, whether clothed for peace or war. Clothed for peace, in costly stuffs and rich colors. The paladin was a tower dyed with the glories of the sunset, plumed and sashed and ironclad for war. He was a still statelier thing to look at. As our showy great company trotted out in column, riding 2 and 2, Joan and the Duke of Alencon in the lead, Deolin, and the big standard-bearer next, and so on, we made a handsome spectacle, as you may well imagine. And as we plowed through the cheering crowds, with Joan bowing her plumed head to left and right, and the sun glinting from her silver mail, the spectators realized that the curtain was rolling up before their eyes upon the first act of a prodigious drama, and their rising hopes were expressed in an enthusiasm that increased with each moment, until at last one seemed to even physically feel the concussion of the huzzas, as well as hear them. Far down the street we heard the softened strains of wind-blown music, and saw a cloud of lances moving, the sun glowing with a subdued light upon the massed armor, but striking bright upon the soaring lance heads, a vaguely luminous nebula, so to speak, with a constellation twinkling above it, and that was our guard of honor. It joined us. The procession was complete. The first war march of Joan of Arc was begun. The curtain was up. Chapter 12. Joan puts heart in her army. We were at Bois 3 days. Oh, that camp! It is one of the treasures of my memory. Order? There was no more order among those brigands than there is among the wolves and the hyenas. They went roaring and drinking about, whooping, shouting, swearing, and entertaining themselves with all manner of rude and riotous horseplay, and the place was full of loud and lewd women, and there were nowhere behind the men for romps and noise and fantastics. It was in the midst of this wild mob that Noel and I had our first glimpse of La Hire. He answered to our dearest dreams. He was of great size and of martial bearing. He was cased in mail from head to heel, with a bushel of swishing plumes on his helmet, and at his side the vast sword of the time. He was on his way to pay his respects in state to Joan, and as he passed through the camp he was restoring order, and proclaiming that the maid had come, and he would have no such spectacle as this exposed to the head of the army. His way of creating order was his own, not borrowed. He did it with his great fists. As he moved along swearing and admonishing, he let drive this way, that way, and the other, and wherever his blow landed, a man went down. "Damn you," he said, staggering and cursing around like this, and the commander-in-chief in the camp. "Straighten up," and he laid the man flat. What his idea of straightening up was his own secret. We followed the veteran to headquarters, listening, observing, admiring, yes, devouring, You may say, the pet hero of the boys of France from our cradles up to their happy day, and their idol in ours. I called to mind how Joan had once rebuked the paladin, there in the pastures of Domrémy, for uttering lightly those mighty names, La Hire and the Bastard of Orleans, and how she said that if she could but be permitted to stand afar off and let her eyes rest once upon those great men, she would hold it a privilege. They were to her and the other girls just what they were to the boys. Well, here was one of them at last, and what was his errand? It was hard to realize it, and yet it was true. He was coming to uncover his head before her and take her orders. While he was quieting a considerable group of his brigands in his soothing way, near headquarters, we stepped on ahead and got a glimpse of Joan's military family, the great chiefs of the army, for they had all arrived now. There they were, 6 officers of wide renown, handsome men in beautiful armor, but the Lord High Admiral of France was the handsomest of them all and had the most gallant bearing. When La Hire entered, one could see the surprise in his face at Joan's beauty and extreme youth, and one could see, too, by Joan's glad smile, that it made her happy to get sight of his hero of her childhood at last. La Hire bowed low, with his helmet in his gauntleted hand, and made a bluff but handsome little speech with hardly an oath in it, and one could see that those two took to each other on the spot. The visit of ceremony was soon over, and the others went away, but La Hire stayed, and he and Joan sat there, and he sipped her wine, and they talked and laughed together like old friends. And presently she gave him some instructions, in his quality as master of the camp, which made his breath stand still. For, to begin with, she said that all those loose women must pack out of the place at once. She wouldn't allow one of them to remain. Next, the rough carousing must stop. Drinking must be brought within proper and strictly defined limits, and discipline must take the place of disorder. And finally she climaxed the list of surprises with this, which nearly lifted him out of his armor. Every man who joins my standard must confess before the priest and absolve himself from sin, and all accepted recruits must be present at divine service twice a day. La Hire could not say a word for a good part of a minute. Then he said, in deep dejection, "Oh, sweet child, they were littered in hell, these poor darlings of mine. Attend Mass? Why, dear heart, they'll see us both damned first." And he went on, pouring out a most pathetic stream of arguments and blasphemy, which broke Joan all up, and made her laugh as she had not laughed since she played in the Domrémy pastures. It was good to hear, but she stuck to her point. So the soldier yielded, and said all right, if such were the orders he must obey, and would do the best that was in him. Then he refreshed himself with a lurid explosion of oaths, and said that if any man in the camp refused to renounce sin and lead a pious life, he would knock his head off. That started Joan off again. She was really having a good time, you see, but she would not consent to that form of conversions. She said they must be voluntary. La Hire said that was all right. He wasn't going to kill the voluntary ones, but only the others. No matter, none of them must be killed. Joan couldn't have it. She said that to give a man a chance to volunteer, on pain of death if he didn't, left him more or less trammeled, and she wanted him to be entirely free. "But, dear man, you are going." "I? Impossible." "Oh, this is lunacy." "Oh, no, it isn't. You are going to the service, twice a day." "Oh, am I dreaming? Am I drunk? Or is my hearing playing me false? Why, I would rather go to—" "Never mind where. In the morning you are going to begin, and after that it will come easy. Now don't look downhearted like that. Soon you won't mind it." La Hire tried to cheer up, but he was not able to do it. He sighed like a zephyr, and presently said, "Well, I'll do it for you, but before I would do it for another, I swear I—" "But don't swear. Break it off." "Break it off? It is impossible. I beg you why, oh, my general, it is my native speech." He begged so hard for grace for his impediment that Joan left him one fragment of it. She said he might swear by his baton, the symbol of his generalship. He promised that he would swear only by his baton when in her presence, and would try to modify himself elsewhere, but doubted he could manage it, now that it was so old and stubborn a habit, and such a solace and support to his declining years. That tough old line went away from there a good deal tamed and civilized, not to say softened and sweetened, for perhaps those expressions would hardly fit him. Noel and I believed that when he was away from Joan's influence, his old aversions would come up so strong in him that he could not master them, and so wouldn't go to Mass. But we got up early in the morning to see. Satan was converted, you see. Well, the rest followed. Joan rode up and down that camp, and wherever that fair young form appeared in its shining armor, with that sweet face to grace the vision and perfect it, the rude host seemed to think they saw the god of war in person, descended out of the clouds, and first they wondered, then they worshipped. After that, she could do with them what she would. In 3 days it was a clean camp and orderly, and those barbarians were herding to divine service twice a day like good children. The women were gone. La Hire was stunned by these marvels. He could not understand them. He went outside the camp when he wanted to swear. He was that sort of a man, sinful by nature and habit, but full of superstitious respect for holy places. The enthusiasm of the Reformed army for Joan, its devotion to her, and the hot desire she had aroused in it to be led against the enemy, exceeded any manifestations of this sort which La Hire had ever seen before in his long career. His admiration of it all, and his wonder over the mystery and miracle of it, were beyond his power to put into words. He had held this army cheap before, but his pride and confidence in it knew no limits now. He said, 2 or 3 days ago it was afraid of a hen roost. One could storm the gates of hell with it now. Joan and he were inseparable, and a quaint and pleasant contrast they made. He was so big, she so little. He was so gray and so far along in his pilgrimage of life, she so youthful. His face was so bronze and scarred, her so fair and pink, so fresh and smooth. She was so gracious, and he so stern. She was so pure, so innocent, he such a cyclopedia of sin. In her eye was stored all charity and compassion, in his lightnings. When her glance fell upon you, it seemed to bring benediction and the peace of God, but with his it was different, generally. They rode through the camp a dozen times a day, visiting every corner of it, observing, inspecting, perfecting, and wherever they appeared the enthusiasm broke forth. They rode side by side, he a great figure of brawn and muscle, she a little masterwork of roundness and grace. He a fortress of rusty iron, she a shining statuette of silver. And when the reformed raiders and bandits caught sight of them, they spoke out, with affection and welcome in their voices, and said, and yet, can any believe it? She carried even that point. She won that incredible victory. She made La Hire pray. It shows, I think, that nothing was impossible to Joan of Arc. Yes, he stood there before her and put up his mailed hands and made a prayer. And it was not borrowed, but was his very own. He had none to help him frame it. He made it out of his own head, saying, Fair Sir God, I pray you to do by La Hire as he would do by you if you were La Hire and he were God. Then he put on his helmet and marched out of Joan's tent as satisfied with himself as anyone might be who had arranged a perplexed and difficult business to the content and admiration of all the parties concerned in the matter. If I had known that he had been praying, I could have understood why he was feeling so superior, but of course I could not know that. I was coming to the tent at that moment, and saw him come out, and saw him march away in that large fashion, and indeed it was fine and beautiful to see. But when I got to the tent door, I stopped and stepped back, grieved and choked, for I heard Joan crying, as I mistakenly thought, crying as if she could not contain nor endure the anguish of a soul, crying as if she would die. But it was not so. She was laughing, laughing at La Hire's prayer. It was not until 36 years afterward I found that out, and then, then I only cried when that picture of young carefree mirth rose before me out of the blur and mist of that long-vanished time. For there had come a day between, when God's good gift of laughter had gone out for me to come again no more in this life. We marched out in great strength and splendor, and took the road toward Orleans. The initial part of Joan's great dream was realizing itself at last. It was the first time that any of us youngsters had ever seen an army, and it was a most stately and imposing spectacle to us. It was indeed an inspiring sight, that interminable column, stretching away into the fading distances, and curving itself in and out of the crookedness of the road like a mighty serpent. Joan rode at the head of it with a personal staff. Then came a body of priests singing the Veni Creator, the banner of the cross rising out of their midst. After these, a glinting forest of spears. The several divisions were commanded by the great Armagnac generals, La Haye and Marshal de Boussac, the Sire de Retz, Florent d'Elias, and Potin de Saint-Trelles. Each in his degree was tough, and there were 3 degrees, tough, tougher, toughest, and La Haye was the last by a shade, but only a shade. They were just illustrious official brigands, the whole party, and by long habits of lawlessness they had lost all acquaintanceship with obedience, if they had ever had any. But what was the good of saying that? These independent birds knew no law. They seldom obeyed the king. They never obeyed him when it didn't suit them to do it. Would they obey the maid? In the first place, they wouldn't know how to obey her or anybody else. And in the second place, it was of course not possible for them to take her military character seriously, that country girl of 17 who had been trained for the complex and terrible business of war. How? By tending sheep. They had no idea of obeying her except in cases where their veteran military knowledge and experience showed them that the thing she required was sound and right, when gauged by the regular military standards. Were they to blame for this attitude? I should think not. Old war-worn captains are hard-headed, practical men. They do not easily believe in the ability of ignorant children to plan campaigns and command armies. No general that ever lived could have taken Joan seriously, militarily, before she raised the siege of Orleans and followed it with a great campaign of the Loire. Did they consider Joan valueless? Far from it. They valued her as the fruitful earth values the sun. They fully believed she could produce the crop, but that it was in their line of business, not hers, to take it off. They had a deep and superstitious reverence for her as being endowed with a mysterious supernatural something that was able to do a mighty thing which they were powerless to do, blow the breath of life and valor into the dead corpses of cowed armies and turn them into heroes. Why was Joan's idea insane, from the general's point of view, but not from hers? Because her plan was to raise the siege immediately, by fighting, while theirs was to besiege the besiegers and starve them out by closing their communications, a plan which would require months in the consummation. The English had built offensive strong fortresses called bastilles around Orleans, fortresses which closed all the gates of the city but one. To the French generals, the idea of trying to fight their way past those fortresses and lead the army into Orleans was preposterous. They believed that the result would be the army's destruction. One may not doubt that their opinion was militarily sound. No, would have been, but for one circumstance which they overlooked. That was this. The English soldiers were in a demoralized condition of superstitious terror. They had become satisfied that the maid was in league with Satan. By reason of this, a good deal of their courage had oozed out and vanished. Joan could have marched by the English forts. However, it was not to be. She had been cheated out of her first chance to strike a heavy blow for her country. In camp that night, she slept in her armor on the ground. It was a cold night, and she was nearly as stiff as her armor itself when we resumed the march in the morning, for iron is not good material for a blanket. However, her joy in being now so far on her way to the theater of her mission was fire enough to warm her, and it soon did it. Her enthusiasm and impatience rose high and higher with every mile of progress, but at last we reached Olivet, and down it went, and indignation took its place, for she saw the trick that had been played upon her. The river lay between us and Orleans. She was for attacking one of the 3 bastilles that were on our side of the river and forcing access to the bridge which it guarded, a project which, if successful, would raise the siege instantly. But a long-ingrained fear of the English came upon her generals, and they implored her not to make the attempt. The soldiers wanted to attack, but had to suffer disappointment. So we moved on and came to a halt at a point opposite Chessy, 6 miles above Orleans. Dunois, bastard of Orleans, with a body of knights and citizens, came up from the city to welcome Joan. Joan was still burning with resentment over the trick that had been put upon her, and was not in the mood for soft speeches, even to revered military idols of her childhood. She said, "Are you the bastard?" "Yes, I am he, and am right glad of your coming." "And did you advise that I be brought by the side of the river, instead of straight to Talbot and the English?" Her high manner abashed him, and he was not able to answer with anything like a confident promptness. But with many hesitations and partial excuses, he managed to get out the confession that for what he and the council had regarded as imperative military reasons, they so advised. "In God's name," said Joan, "my lord's counsel is safer and wiser than yours. You thought to deceive me, but you have deceived yourselves, for I bring you the best help that ever knight or city had. For it is God's help, not sent for love of me, but by God's pleasure. At the prayer of St. Louis and St. Charlemagne, he has had pity on Orleans, and will not suffer the enemy to have both the Duke of Orleans and his city. The provisions to save the starving people are here. The boats are below the city. The wind is contrary. They cannot come up hither. Now then, tell me, in God's name, you were so wise, what that council of yours was thinking about to invent this foolish difficulty." Dunois and the rest fumbled around the matter a moment, then gave in and conceded that a blunder had been made. "Yes, a blunder has been made," said Joan, "and except God take your proper work upon himself and change the wind and correct your blunder for you, there is none else that can devise a remedy." Some of these people began to perceive that with all her technical ignorance she had practical good sense, and that with all her native sweetness and charm she was not the right kind of a person to play with. Presently God did take the blunder in hand, and by his grace the wind did change. So the fleet of boats came up and went away loaded with provisions and cattle, and conveyed that welcome succor to the hungry city, managing the matter successfully under protection of a sortie from the walls against the Bastille of St. Loup. Then Joan began on the bastard again. "You see here the army." "Yes." "It is here on this side by advice of your council." "Yes." "Now, in God's name, can that wise council explain why it is better to have it here than it would be to have it in the bottom of the sea?" Dunois made some wandering attempt to explain the inexplicable and excuse the inexcusable, but Joan cut him short and said, "The bastard confessed that it hadn't. That is, in view of the plan of campaign which he had devised and decreed. And yet, knowing this, you had the hardihood to disobey my orders. Since the army's place is on the other side, will you explain to me how it is to get there?" The whole size of the needless muddle was apparent. Evasions were of no use. Therefore Dunois admitted that there was no way to correct the blunder but to send the army all the way back to Blois, and let it begin over again and come up on the other side this time, according to Joan's original plan. Any other girl, after winning such a triumph as this over a veteran soldier of old renown, might have exulted a little and been excusable for it, but Joan showed no disposition of this sort. She dropped a word or two of grief over the precious time that must be lost, then began at once to issue commands for the march back. She sorrowed to see her army go, for she said its heart was great and its enthusiasm high, and that with it at her back she did not fear to face all the might of England. All arrangements having been completed for the return of the main body of the army, she took the bastard and La Hire and 1,000 men and went down to Orleans, where all the town was in a fever of impatience to have sight of her face. It was 8 in the evening when she and the troops rode in at the Burgundy gate, with the paladin preceding her with a standard. She was riding a white horse, and she carried in her hand the sacred sword of Febois. You should have seen Orleans then. What a picture it was! Such black seas of people, such a starry firmament of torches, such roaring whirlwinds of welcome, such booming of bells and thundering of cannon. It was as if the world was come to an end. Everywhere in the glare of the torches one saw rank upon rank of upturned white faces, the mouths wide open, shouting, and the unchecked tears running down. Joan forged a slow way through the solid masses, her mailed form projecting above the pavement of heads like a silver statue. The people about her struggled along, gazing up at her through their tears with the rapt look of men and women who believe they are seeing one who is divine, and always her feet were being kissed by grateful folk, and such as failed of that privilege touch a horse and then kiss their fingers. Nothing that Joan did escape notice. Everything she did was commented upon and applauded. You could hear the remarks going all the time. Now she's taking her little plume cap off to somebody. Ah, it's fine and graceful. She's patting that woman on the head with a gauntlet. Now there's a poor woman lifting up a child. She's kissed it. Oh, she's divine. Joan's slender long banner streaming backward had an accident. The fringe caught fire from a torch. She leaned forward and crushed the flame in her hand. "She's not afraid of fire nor anything," they shouted, and delivered a storm of admiring applause that made everything quake. She rode to the cathedral and gave thanks to God, and the people crammed the place and added their devotions to hers. Then she took up a march again and picked a slow way through the crowds and the wilderness of torches to the house of Jacques Boucher, treasurer of the Duke of Orleans, where she was to be the guest of his wife as long as she stayed in the city, and have his young daughter for comrade and roommate. The delirium of the people went on the rest of the night, and with the clamor of the joy bells and the welcoming cannon, Joan of Arc had stepped upon a stage at last, and was ready to begin. She was ready, but must sit down and wait until there was an army to work with. Next morning, Saturday, April 30th, 1429, she set about inquiring after the messenger who carried her proclamation to the English from Blois, the one which he had dictated at Poitiers. Here is a copy of it. It is a remarkable document, for several reasons. For its matter-of-fact directness, for its high spirit and forcible diction, and for its naive confidence in her ability to achieve the prodigious task which she had laid upon herself, or which had been laid upon her, which you please. All through it you seem to see the pomps of war and hear the rumbling of the drums. In it Joan's warrior soul is revealed, and for the moment the soft little shepherdess has disappeared from your view. This untaught country damsel, unused at dictating anything at all to anybody, much less documents of state to kings and generals, poured out this procession of vigorous sentences as fluently as if this sort of work had been a trade from childhood. Jesus Maria, King of England, and you Duke of Bedford, who call yourself Regent of France, William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and you Thomas Lord Scales, who style yourselves lieutenants of the said Bedford, do right to the King of Heaven. Render to the maid who is sent by God the keys of all the good towns you have taken and violated in France. She is sent hither by God to restore the blood royal. She is very ready to make peace if you will do her right, by giving up France and paying for what you have held. And you archers, companions of war, noble and otherwise, who are before the good city of Orleans, but gone into your own land in God's name, or expect new from a maid who will shortly go to see you to your very great hurt. King of England, if you do not so, I am chief of war, and whenever I shall find your people in France, I will drive them out, willing or not willing. And if they do not obey, I will slay them all. But if they obey, I will have them to mercy. I am come hither by God, the King of Heaven, body for body, to put you out of France, in spite of those who would work treason and mischief against the kingdom. Think not you shall ever hold the kingdom from a King of Heaven, the Son of the blessed Mary. King Charles shall hold it, for God wills it so, and has revealed it to him by the maid. If you believe not the news sent by God through the maid, wherever we shall meet you, we will strike boldly and make such a noise as has not been in France these 1,000 years. Be sure that God can send more strength to the maid than you can bring to any assault against her and the good men-at-arms. And then we shall see who has the better right, the King of Heaven or you. Duke of Bedford, the maid prays you not to bring about your own destruction. So now she sent her 2 heralds with a new letter warning the English to raise the siege, and requiring them to restore that missing messenger. The heralds came back without him. All they brought was notice from the English to Joan that they would presently catch her and burn her if she did not clear out now while she had a chance, and go back to her proper trade of minding cows. I did not hear this, but Dunois did, and spoke of it. The challenge was refused. Chapter 15, my exquisite poem goes to smash. We OF the personal staff were in Fairyland now, during the few days that we waited for the return of the army. We went into society. To our 2 knights this was not a novelty, but to us young villagers it was a new and wonderful life. Any position of any sort near the person of the maid of Vaucouleurs conferred high distinction upon the holder and caused the society to be courted, and so the Dark Brothers, and Noel, and the Paladin, humble peasants at home, were gentlemen here, personages of weight and influence. It was fine to see how soon their country diffidences and awkwardnesses melted away under this pleasant sun of deference and disappeared, and how lightly and easily they took to their new atmosphere. The Paladin was as happy as it was possible for any one in this earth to be. His tongue went all the time, and daily he got new delight out of hearing himself talk. He began to enlarge his ancestry and spread out all around, and ennoble it right and left, and it was not long until it consisted almost entirely of dukes. He worked up his old battles and tricked them out with fresh splendors, also with new terrors. For he added artillery now. We had seen cannon for the first time at Blois, a few pieces. Here there was plenty of it, and now and then we had the impressive spectacle of a huge English Bastille hidden from sight in a mountain of smoke from its own guns, with lances of red flame darting through it. And this grand picture, along with the quaking thunders pounding away in the heart of it, inflamed the paladin's imagination and enabled him to dress out those ambuscade skirmishes of ours with a sublimity which made it impossible for any to recognize them at all except people who had not been there. You may suspect that there was a special inspiration for these great efforts of the paladins, and there was. It was the daughter of the house, Catherine Boucher, who was 18 and gentle and lovely in her ways, and very beautiful. I think she might have been as beautiful as Joan herself, if she had had Joan's eyes. But that could never be. There was never but that one pair. There will never be another. Joan's eyes were deep and rich and wonderful beyond anything merely earthly. They spoke all the languages. They had no need of words. They produced all effects, and just by a glance, just a single glance, a glance that could convict a liar of his lie and make him confess it, that could bring down a proud man's pride and make him humble, that could put courage into a coward and strike dead the courage of the bravest, that could appease resentments and real hatreds, that could make the doubter believe and the hopeless hope again, that could purify the impure mind, that could persuade. Ah, there it is. Persuasion. That is the word. What or who is it that it couldn't persuade? The maniac of Domrémy, the fairy banishing priest, the reverend tribunal of Toul, the doubting and superstitious Laxout, the obstinate veteran of Vaucouleurs, the characterless heir of France, the sages and scholars of the Parliament and University of Poitiers, the darling of Satan, La Haye, the masterless bastard of Orleans, accustomed to acknowledge no way as right and rational but his own. These were the trophies of that great gift that made her the wonder and mystery that she was. We mingled companionably with the great folk who flocked to the big house to make Joan's acquaintance, and they made much of us, and we lived in the clouds, so to speak. But what we preferred even to this happiness was the quieter occasions, when the formal guests were gone and the family and a few dozen of its familiar friends were gathered together for a social good time. It was then that we did our best, we 5 youngsters, with such fascinations as we had, and the chief object of them was Catherine. None of us had ever been in love before, and now we had the misfortune to all fall in love with the same person at the same time, which was the first moment we saw her. The paladin made us all jealous the first night, for when he got fairly started on those battles of his, he had everything to himself, and there was no use in anybody else's trying to get any attention. Those people had been living in the midst of real war for 7 months, and to hear this windy giant lay out his imaginary campaigns and fairly swim in blood and spatter it all around, entertained them to the verge of the grave. Catherine was like to die for pure enjoyment. She didn't laugh loud. We, of course, wish she would, but kept in the shelter of a fan, and shook until there was danger that she would unhitch her ribs from her spine. Then, when the paladin had got done with the battle and we began to feel thankful and hope for a change, she would speak up in a way that was so sweet and persuasive that it rankled in me, and ask him about some detail or other in the early part of his battle, which he said had greatly interested her, and would he be so good as to describe that part again and with a little more particularity, which of course precipitated the whole battle on us, again, with 100 lies added that had been overlooked before. I do not know how to make you realize the pain I suffered. I had never been jealous before, and it seemed intolerable that this creature should have his good fortune which he was so entitled to, and I have to sit and see myself neglected when I was so longing for the least little attention out of the 1,000 that this beloved girl was lavishing on him. I was near her, and tried 2 or 3 times to get started on some of the things that I had done in those battles, and I felt ashamed of myself, too, for stooping to such a business. But she cared for nothing but his battles, and could not be got to listen. And presently, when one of my attempts caused her to lose some precious rag or other of his mendacities, and she asked him to repeat, thus bringing on a new engagement, of course, and increasing the havoc and carnage tenfold, I felt so humiliated by this pitiful miscarriage of mine that I gave up and tried no more. The others were as outraged by the paladin's selfish conduct as I was, and by his grand luck, too, of course, perhaps, indeed, that was the main hurt. We talked our trouble over together. which was natural, for rivals become brothers when a common affliction assails them and a common enemy bays off the victory. Each of us could do things that would please and get noticed if it were not for this person, who occupied all the time and gave others no chance. I had made a poem, taking a whole night to it, a poem in which I most happily and delicately celebrated that sweet girl's charms, without mentioning her name, but anyone could see who was meant, for the bare title, The Rose of Orleans, would reveal that, as it seemed to me, it pictured this pure and dainty white rose as growing up out of the rude soil of war and looking abroad out of its tender eyes upon the horrid machinery of death, and then, note this conceit, it blushes for the sinful nature of man and turns red in a single night. Becomes a red rose. You see, a rose that was white before. The idea was my own, and quite new. Then it sent its sweet perfume out over the embattled city, and when the beleaguering forces smelled it, they laid down their arms and wept. This was also my own idea, and new. That closed that part of the poem. Then I put her into the similitude of the firmament, not the whole of it, but only part. That is to say, she was the moon, and all the constellations were following her about, their hearts inflamed for love of her. But she would not halt, she would not listen, for 'twas thought she loved another. 'Twas thought she loved a poor unworthy suppliant who was upon the earth, facing danger, death, and possible mutilation in the bloody field, waging relentless war against a heartless foe to save her from an all-too-early grave, and a city from destruction. And when the sad pursuing constellations came to know and realize the bitter sorrow that was come upon them, note this idea. Their hearts broke and their tears gushed forth, filling the vault of heaven with a fiery splendor, for those tears were falling stars. There were 8 four-line stanzas in the first end of the poem, the end about the rose, the horticultural end, as you may say, if that is not too large a name for such a little poem, and 8 in the astronomical end, 16 stanzas altogether, and I could have made it 150 if I had wanted to. I was so inspired and so all swelled up with beautiful thoughts and fancies, but that would have been too many to sing or recite before company that way, whereas 16 was just right, and could be done over again if desired. The boys were amazed that I could make such a poem as that out of my own head, and so was I, of course, it being as much a surprise to me as it could be to anybody, for I did not know that it was in me. If any had asked me a single day before if it was in me, I should have told them frankly no, it was not. That is the way with us. We may go on half of our life not knowing such a thing is in us, when in reality it was there all the time, and all we needed was something to turn up that would call for it. Indeed, it was always so with our family. My grandfather had a cancer, and they never knew what was the matter with him till he died, and he didn't know himself. It is wonderful how gifts and diseases can be concealed in that way. All that was necessary in my case was for this lovely and inspiring girl to cross my path, and out came the poem, and no more trouble to me to word it and rhyme it and perfect it than it is to stone a dog. No, I should have said it was not in me, but it was. The boys couldn't say enough about it. They were so charmed and astonished. The thing that pleased them the most was the way it would do the paladin's business for him. They forgot everything in their anxiety to get him shelved and silenced. Noel Raingesson was clear beside himself with admiration of the poem, and wished he could do such a thing, but it was out of his line, and he couldn't, of course. He had it by heart in half an hour, and there was never anything so pathetic and beautiful as the way he recited it. For that was just his gift, that and mimicry. He could recite anything better than anybody in the world, and he could take of la higher to the very life, or anybody else, for that matter. Now I never could recite worth a farthing, and when I tried with this poem the boys wouldn't let me finish. They would have nobody but Noel. So then, as I wanted the poem to make the best possible impression on Catherine the company, I told Noel he might do the reciting. Never was anybody so delighted. He could hardly believe that I was in earnest, but I was. I said that to have them know that I was the author of it would be enough for me. The boys were full of exultation, and Noel said if he could just get one chance at those people, it would be all he would ask. He would make them realize that there was something higher and finer than walleyes to be had here. But how to get the opportunity? That was the difficulty. We invented several schemes that promised fairly, and at last we hit upon one that was sure. That was to let the paladin get a good start in a manufactured battle, and then send in a false call for him. and as soon as he was out of the room, have Noel take his place and finish the battle himself in the paladin's own style, imitated to a shade, that would get great applause, and win the house's favor, and put it in the right mood to hear the poem. The two triumphs together would finish the standard bearer, modify him, anyway, to a certainty, and give the rest of us a chance for the future. So the next night I kept out of the way until the paladin had got his start and was sweeping down upon the enemy like a whirlwind at the head of his corps. Then I stepped within the door in my official uniform and announced that a messenger from General La Haye's quarters desired speech with the standard bearer. He left the room, and Noel took his place and said that the interruption was to be deplored, but that fortunately he was personally acquainted with the details of the battle himself, and if permitted would be glad to state them to the company. Then, without waiting for the permission, he turned himself to the paladin, a dwarf paladin, of course, with manner, tones, gestures, attitudes, everything exact, and went right on with the battle, and it will be impossible to imagine a more perfectly and minutely ridiculous imitation than he furnished to those shrieking people. They went into spasms, convulsions, frenzies of laughter, and the tears flowed down their cheeks in rivulets. The more they laughed, the more inspired Noel grew with his theme and the greater marvels he worked, till really the laughter was not properly laughing any more, but screaming. Blessed feature of all, Catherine Boucher was dying with ecstasies, and presently there was little left of her but gasps and suffocations. Victory? It was a perfect Agincourt. The paladin was gone only a couple of minutes. He found out at once that a trick had been played on him, so he came back. When he approached the door, he heard Noel ranting in there and recognized the state of the case. So he remained near the door but out of sight, and heard the performance through to the end. The applause Noel got when he finished was wonderful, and they kept it up, clapping their hands like mad, and shouting to him to do it over again. But Noel was clever. He knew the very best background for a poem of deep and refined sentiment and pathetic melancholy was one where great and satisfying merriment had prepared the spirit for the powerful contrast. So he paused until all was quiet. Then his face grew grave and assumed an impressive aspect, and at once all faces sobered in sympathy and took on a look of wondering and expectant interest. Now he began in a low but distinct voice the opening verses of the Rose. As he breathed the rhythmic measures forth, and one gracious line after another fell upon those enchanted ears in the deep hush, one could catch, on every hand, half-audible ejaculations of how lovely, how beautiful, how exquisite. By this time the paladin, who had gone away for a moment with the opening of the poem, was back again, and had stepped within the door. He stood there now, resting his great frame against the wall, and gazing toward the reciter like one entranced. When Noel got to the second part, and that heartbreaking refrain began to melt and move all listeners, the paladin began to wipe away tears with the back of first one hand and then the other. The next time the refrain was repeated, he got to snuffling and sort of half-sobbing, and went to wiping his eyes with the sleeves of his doublet. He was so conspicuous that he embarrassed Noel a little, and also had an ill effect upon the audience. Noel was wholly drowned out in silence, and those people were laughing the very lungs out of themselves. It was the most degrading sight that ever was. Now I heard the clankety-clank that plate armor makes when the man that is in it is running, and then alongside my head there burst out the most inhuman explosion of laughter that ever rent the drum of a person's ear, and I looked, and it was La Haye, and the stood there with his gauntlets on his hips and his head tilted back, and his jaws spread to that degree to let out his hurricanes and his thunders that amounted to indecent exposure, for you could see everything that was in him. Such things make a life of bitterness, and I do not wish to dwell upon them. The effect of the poem was spoiled. Chapter 16, The Finding of the Dwarf. This episode disagreed with me, and I was not able to leave my bed the next day. The others were in the same condition. But for this, one or another of us might have had the good luck that fell to the paladin's share that day. But it is observable that God in his compassion sends a good luck to such as are ill-equipped with gifts as compensation for their defect, but requires such as are more fortunately endowed to get by labor and talent what those others get by chance. It was Noel who said this, and it seemed to me to be well and justly thought. The paladin, going about the town all the day in order to be followed and admired and overhear the people say in an awed voice, SSH, look, it is the standard bearer of Joan of Arc, had speech with all sorts and conditions of folk, and he learned from some boatmen that there was a stir of some kind going on in the Bastilles on the other side of the river, and in the evening, seeking further, he found a deserter from a fortress called the Augustines, who said that the English were going to send me over to strengthen the garrisons on our side during the darkness of the night, and were exulting greatly, for they meant to spring upon Dunois and the army when it was passing the Bastilles and destroy it. A thing quite easy to do, since which would not be there, and without her presence the army would do like the French armies of these many years past, drop their weapons and run when they saw an English face. It was 10 at night when the paladin brought this news and asked leave to speak to Joan, and I was up and on duty then. It was a bitter stroke to me to see what a chance I had lost. Joan made searching inquiries, and satisfied herself that the word was true. Then she made this annoying remark: "You have done well, and you have my thanks. It may be that you have prevented a disaster. Your name and service shall receive official mention." Then he bowed low, and when he rose he was 11 feet high. As he swelled out past me, he covertly pulled down the corner of his eye with his finger and muttered part of the defiled refrain. "Oh, 'tis, ah, 'tis, oh, sad sweet 'tis. Name in general orders, personal mention to the king, you see." I wish Joan could have seen his conduct, but she was busy thinking what she would do. Then she had me fetch the Knight Jean de Metz, and in a minute he was off at our highest quarters with orders for him and the Lord de Villers and Florent d'Elias to report to her at 5 o'clock next morning with 500 picked men well mounted. The histories say 4:30, but it is not true. I heard the order given. We were on our way at 5 to the minute, and encountered the head of the arriving column between 6 and 7, a couple of leagues from the city. Dunois was pleased, for the army had begun to get restive and show uneasiness now that it was getting so near to the dreaded Bastilles. But that all disappeared now, as the word ran down the line, with a huzzah that swept along the length of it like a wave, that the Maid was come. Dunois asked her to halt and let the column pass in review, so that the men could be sure that the reports of her presence was not a ruse to revive their courage. So she took position at the side of the road with a staff, and the battalion swung by with a martial stride, huzzahing. Joan was armed, except her head. She was wearing the cunning little velvet cap, with a mess of curved white ostrich plumes tumbling over its edges, which the city of Orleans had given her the night she arrived, the one that is in the picture that hangs in the Hotel de Ville at Rouen. She was looking about 15. The sight of soldiers always set her blood to leaping, and lit the fires in her eyes and brought the warm, rich color to her cheeks. It was then that you saw that she was too beautiful to be of the earth, or at any rate that there was a subtle something somewhere about her beauty that differed it from the human types of your experience and exalted it above them. "What is he that is bound there?" she asked. "A prisoner, General." "He is a deserter. He will be hanged, but it was not convenient on the march, and there was no hurry. He is a good soldier, but he asked leave to go and see his wife who was dying. He said, but it could not be granted, so he went without leave. Meanwhile the march began, and he only overtook us yesterday evening." "Overtook you? Did he come of his own will?" "Yes, it was of his own will." "What is it?" she said. "He is under sentence." "Yes, I know. I am responsible for him." And she cut the bonds. They had lacerated his wrists, and they were bleeding. "Aye, pitiful," she said. "Blood, I do not like it." And she shrank from the sight, but only for a moment. "Give me something, somebody to bandage his wrist with," the officer said. The man looked unsilent while he was being bandaged, stealing a furtive glance at Joan's face occasionally, such as an animal might that is receiving a kindness from an unexpected quarter and is gropingly trying to reconcile the act with its source. All the staff had forgotten the huzzaing army drifting by in its rolling clouds of dust, to crane their necks and watch the bandaging as if it was the most interesting and absorbing novelty that ever was. I have often seen people do like that, get entirely lost in the simplest trifle, when it is something that is out of their line. Now they're in Poitiers. Once, I saw 2 bishops and a dozen of those grave and famous scholars grouped together watching a man paint a sign on a shop, They didn't breathe. They were as good as dead. And when it began to sprinkle, they didn't know it at first. Then they noticed it, and each man hove a deep sigh and glanced up with a surprised look as wondering to see the others there, and how he came to be there himself. But that is the way with people, as I have said. There is no way of accounting for people. You have to take them as they are. The giant said, "It was this way, my angel. My mother died, then my 3 little children, one after the other, all in 2 years. It was a famine. Others fared so. It was God's will. I saw them die. I had that grace, and I buried them. Then when my poor wife's fate was come, I begged for leave to go to her. She was so dear to me. She was all I had. I begged on my knees. But they would not let me. Could I let her die, friendless and alone? Could I let her die believing I would not come? Would she let me die and she not come, with her feet free to do it if she would, and no cost upon it but only her life? Aye, she would come through the fire. So I went. I saw her. She died in my arms. I buried her. Then the army was gone. I had trouble to overtake it, but my legs are long and there are many hours in a day. I overtook it last night." Joan said, musingly, as if she were thinking aloud, "It sounds true. If true, it were no great harm to suspend the law this one time. Any would say that. It may not be true, but if it is true." She turned suddenly to the man and said, "I would see your eyes. Look up." The eyes of the two met, and Joan said to the officer, "This man is pardoned. Give you good day. You may go." Then she said to the man, "Did you know it was death to come back to the army?" The man said, quite simply, "Because it was death. She was all I had. There was nothing left to love." "Ah, yes, there was France. The children of France have always their mother. They cannot be left with nothing to love. You shall live, and you shall serve France." "I will serve you." "You shall fight for France." "You shall be France's soldier." "I will be your soldier." "You shall give all your heart to France." "I will give all my heart to you, and all my soul, if I have one, and all my strength, which is great, for I was dead and am alive again. I had nothing to live for, but now I have. You are France for me. You are my France, and I will have no other." Joan smiled, and was touched and pleased with the man's grave enthusiasm. Solemn enthusiasm, one may call it, for the meaning of it was deeper than mere gravity. And she said, "Well, it shall be as you will. What are you called?" The man answered with unsmiling simplicity, "They call me the dwarf, but I think it is more in jest than otherwise." It made Joan laugh, and she said, "It has something of that look truly. What is the office of that vast axe?" The soldier replied with the same gravity, which must have been born to him. It set upon him so naturally. It is to persuade persons to respect France. Joan laughed again and said, "Have you given many lessons?" "Ah, indeed, yes, many." "The pupils behaved to suit you afterward?" "Yes, it made them quiet, quite pleasant and quiet." That is how we came by the dwarf, and a good fellow he was. Joan picked him out on sight, but it wasn't a mistake. No one could be faithfuler than he was, and he was a devil and the son of a devil when he turned himself loose with his axe. He was so big that he made the paladin look like an ordinary man. He liked to like people, therefore people liked him. He liked us boys from the start, and he liked the knights, and liked pretty much everybody he came across, but he thought more of a paring of Joan's fingernail than he did of all the rest of the world put together. Yes, that is where we got him, stretched on the wane, going to his death, poor chap, and nobody to say a good word for him. He was a good find. Why, the knights treated him almost like an equal. It is the honest truth. That is the sort of a man he was. They called him the Bastille sometimes, and sometimes they called him Hellfire, which was on account of his warm and sumptuous style in battle. And you know they wouldn't have given him pet names if they hadn't had a good deal of affection for him. To the dwarf, Joan was France, the spirit of France made flesh. He never got away from that idea that he had started with, and God knows it was a true one. That was a humble eye to see so great a truth where some others failed. To me, that seems quite remarkable. And yet, after all, it was, in a way, just what nations do. When they love a great and noble thing, they embody it. They want it so that they can see it with their eyes. Like liberty, for instance. They are not content with a cloudy abstract idea. They make a beautiful statue of it. And then their beloved idea is substantial and they can look at it and worship it. And so it is as I say. To the dwarf, Joan was our country embodied, our country made visible flesh cast in gracious form. When she stood before others, they saw Joan of Arc, but he saw France. Sometimes he would speak of her by that name. It shows you how the idea was embedded in his mind and how real it was to him. The world has called our kings by it, but I know of none of them who has had so good a right as she to that sublime title. But Joan was at home, in paradise, I might say. She sat up straight, and I could see that she was feeling different from me. The awfulest thing was the silence. There wasn't a sound but the squeaking of the saddles, the measured tramplings, and the sneezing of the horses, afflicted by the smothering dust clouds which they kicked up. I wanted to sneeze myself, but it seemed to me that I would rather go unsneezed, or suffer even a bitterer torture, if there is one, than attract attention to myself. I was not of a rank to make suggestions, or I would have suggested that if we went faster we should get by sooner. It seemed to me that it was an ill-judged time to be taking a walk. Just as we were drifting in that suffocating stillness past a great cannon that stood just within a raised portcullis, with nothing between me and it but the moat, a most uncommon jackass in there split the world with his bray, and I fell out of the saddle. Sir Bertrand grabbed me as I went, which was well, for if I had gone to the ground in my armor I could not have gotten up again by myself. The English warders on the battlements laughed a coarse laugh, forgetting that every one must begin, and that there had been a time when they themselves would have fared no better when shot by a jackass. It was on this march that the Histories et Devoirs told Joan that the English were expecting reinforcements under command of Sir John Fastolf, and that she turned upon him and said, "Bastard, bastard, in God's name I warn you to let me know of his coming as soon as you hear of it, for if he passes without my knowledge you shall lose your head." But I did hear something that the histories didn't mention and don't know about. I heard Joan say that now that the garrisons on the other wide had been weakened to strengthen those on our side, the most effective point of operations had shifted to the south shore, so she meant to go over there and storm the forts which held the bridge end, and that would open up communication with our own dominions and raise the siege. The generals began to balk, privately, right away, but they only baffled and delayed her, and that for only 4 days. All Orleans met the army at the gate and hazarded through the banded streets to its various quarters, but nobody had to rock it to sleep. It slumped down dog-tired, for Dunois had rushed it without mercy, and for the next 24 hours it would be quiet, all but the snoring. Chapter 17, Sweet Fruit of Bitter Truth. When W.E. got home, breakfast for us minor fry was waiting in our mess room, and the family honored us by coming in to eat it with us. The nice old treasurer, and in fact all three were flatteringly eager to hear about our adventures. Nobody asked the paladin to begin, but he did begin, because now that his specially ordained and peculiar military rank set him above everybody on the personal staff but old Deolin, who didn't eat with us. He didn't care a farthing for the knight's nobility, no mind, but took precedence in the talk whenever it suited him, which was all the time because he was born that way. He said, "Animals," said Miss Catherine. "I will explain to you what he means," said Noel. "I will trouble you not to trouble yourself to explain anything for me," said the paladin, loftily. "I have reason to think." "Prudence," I said, seeing my chance of help. But it was not a fortunate remark, for the paladin said, "Very well, if you want to call it that, I am not objecting. What would you call it, Sir Bertrand?" Well, whatever it was excusable, I think. All of you have learned how to behave in hot hand-to-hand engagements, and you don't need to be ashamed of your record in that matter, but to walk along in front of death, with one's hands idle, and no noise, no music, and nothing going on, is a very trying situation. If I were you, de Conte, I would name the emotion. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It was as straight and sensible a speech as ever I heard, and I was grateful for the opening it gave me. So I came out and said, "Sir," Jean de Metz said, "we were all in a body together when the donkey brayed, and it was dismally still at the time. I don't see how any young campaigner could escape some little touch of that emotion." He looked about him with a pleasant expression of inquiry on his good face, and as each pair of eyes in turn met his head, they were a nod of confession. Even the paladin delivered his nod. That surprised everybody, and saved the standard-bearer's credit. It was clever of him. Nobody believed he could tell the truth that way without practice, or would tell the particular sort of a truth either with or without practice. I suppose he judged it would favorably impress the family. Then the old treasurer said, "Passing the forts in that trying way require the same sort of nerve a person must have when ghosts are about him in the dark, I should think. What does the standard-bearer think?" "Well, I don't quite know about that, sir. I've often thought I would like to see a ghost if I—" "Would you?" exclaimed the young lady. "We've got one. Would you try that one? Will you?" She was so eager and pretty that the paladin said straight out that he would. And then, as none of the rest had bravery enough to expose the fear that was in him, one volunteered after the other with a prompt mouth and a sick heart till all was shipped for the voyage. Then the girl clapped her hands in glee, and the parents were gratified, too, saying that the ghost of their house had been a dread and misery to them and their forebears for generations, and nobody had ever been found yet who was willing to confront them and find out what their trouble was, so that the family could heal it and content the poor specters and beguile them to tranquility and peace. About noon I was chatting with Madame Boucher. Nothing was going on. All was quiet, when Catherine Boucher suddenly entered in great excitement and said, "Fly, sir, fly." The maid was doing a chair in my room, when she sprang up and cried out, "French blood is flowing. My arms, give me my arms." Her giant was on guard at the door, and he brought Deolin, who began to arm her, and I and the giant had been warning the staff. "Fly, and stay by her, and if there really is a battle, keep her out of it. Don't let her risk herself. There is no need. If the men know she is near and looking on, it is all that is necessary. Keep her out of the fight. Don't fail of this." I started on a run, saying sarcastically, for I was always fond of sarcasm, and it was said that I had a most neat gift that way. "Oh, yes, nothing easier than that. I'll attend to it." At the furthest end of the house I met Joan, fully armed, hurrying toward the door, and she said, "Ah, French blood is being spilt, and you did not tell me." "Indeed I did not know it," I said. "There are no sounds of war. Everything is quiet, Your Excellency." It was true. Before one could count 5 there broke upon the stillness the swelling rush and tramp of an approaching multitude of men and horses, with hoarse cries of command, and then out of the distance came the muffled deep boom, 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 of cannon, and straightway that rushing multitude was roaring by the house like a hurricane. Our knights and all our staff came flying, armed, but with no horses ready, and we burst out after Joan in a body, the paladin in the lead with the banner. The surging crowd was made up half of citizens and half of soldiers, and had no recognized leader. When Joan was in, a huzzah went up, and she shouted. A dozen saddles were at her disposal in a moment. She mounted, 100 people shouting, "Way, there, way for the Maid of Orleans." The first time that immortal name was ever uttered, and I, praise God, was there to hear it. The mass divided itself like the waters of the Red Sea, and down this lane Joan went skimming like a bird, crying, "Forward, French hearts, follow me!" And we came winging in a wake on the rest of the borrowed horses, the holy standard streaming above us, and the lane closing together in our rear. As we poured out at the gate, we met a force bringing in the wounded from the front. The sight moved Joan, and she said, "We were soon on the field, soon in the midst of the turmoil." Joan was seeing her first real battle, and so were we. It was a battle in the open field, for the garrison of St. Loup had sallied confidently out to meet the attack, being used to victories when witches were not around. The sally had been reinforced by troops from the Paris Bastille, and when we approached the French were getting whipped and were falling back. But when Joan came charging through the disorder with her banner displayed, crying, "Forward! Men, follow me!" there was a change. The French turned about and surged forward like a solid wave of the sea, and swept the English before them, hacking and slashing, and being hacked and slashed in a way that was terrible to see. In the field the dwarf had no assignment. That is to say, he was not under orders to occupy any particular place. Therefore he chose his place for himself, and went ahead of Joan and made a road for her. It was horrible to see the iron helmets fly into fragments under his dreadful axe. He called it cracking nuts, and it looked like that. He made a good road, and paved it well with flesh and iron. Joan and the rest of us followed it so briskly that we outspeeded our forces, and had the English behind us as well as before. The knights commanded us to face outward around Joan, which we did, and then there was work done that was fine to see. One was obliged to respect the paladin. Now, being right under Joan's exalting and transforming eye, he forgot his native prudence. He forgot his diffidence in the presence of danger. He forgot what fear was, and he never laid about him in his imaginary battles in a more tremendous way than he did in this real one. And wherever he struck there was an enemy the less. We were in that closed place only a few minutes. Then our forces to the rear broke through with a great shout and joined us, and then the English fought a retreating fight, but in a fine and gallant way, and we drove them to their fortress foot by foot, they facing us all the time, and their reserves on the walls raining showers of arrows, crossbow bolts, and stone cannonballs upon us. The bulk of the enemy got safely within the works, and left us outside with piles of French and English dead and wounded for company. A sickening sight, an awful sight to us youngsters, for our little ambush fights in February had been in the night, and the blood and the mutilations and the dead faces were mercifully dim, whereas we saw these things now for the first time in all their naked ghastliness. Now! Hardly now, bastard. Not yet. Why not yet? Is there more to be done? More. Bastard, we have but begun. We will take this fortress. Ah, you can't be serious. We can't take this place. Let me urge you not to make the attempt. It is too desperate. Let me order the forces back. Bastard, bastard, will you play always with these English? Now, verily I tell you, we will not budge until this place is ours. We will carry it by storm. Sound the charge. Waste no more time, man. Let the bugles sound the assault. And we saw that strange deep light in her eye which we named the battle light, and learned to know so well in later fields. Among the prisoners were a number of priests, and Joan took these under protection and saved their lives. It was urged that they were most probably combatants in disguise, but she said, "As to that, how can any tell? They wear the livery of God, and if even one of these weighs it rightfully, surely it were better that all the guilty should escape than that we have upon our hands the blood of that innocent man. I will lodge them where I lodge, and feed them, and send them away in safety. It is a happiness to me to remember that I heard that name the first time it was ever uttered. Between that first utterance and the last time it will be uttered on this earth, think how many moldering ages will lie in that gap." He could not go on forever. When he had carried the Bastille by assault and eaten up the garrison, there was nothing for it but to stop, unless Catherine Boucher would give him a new start and have it all done over again, as we hoped she would, this time. But she was otherwise minded. As soon as there was a good opening and a fair chance, she brought up her unwelcome subject, and we faced it the best we could. We followed her and her parents to the haunted room at 11 o'clock, with candles, and also with torches to place in the sockets on the walls. It was a big house, with very thick walls, and this room was in a remote part of it which had been left unoccupied for nobody knew how many years, because of its evil repute. This was a large room, like a salon, and had a big table in it of enduring oak and well preserved. But the chair were worm-eaten, and the tapestry on the walls was rotten and discolored by age. The dusty cobwebs under the ceiling had the look of not having had any business for a century. Catherine said, "Tradition says that these ghosts have never been seen. They have merely been heard. It is plain that this room was once larger than it is now, and that the wall at this end was built in some bygone time to make and fence off a narrow room there. There is no communication anywhere with that narrow room, and if it exists, and of that there is no reasonable doubt, It has no light and no air, but is an absolute dungeon. Wait where you are, and take note of what happens." And then these ghosts were invisible, which made the matter the worse, as it seemed to me. They might be in the room with us at that moment. We could not know. I felt airy touches on my shoulders and my hair, and I shrank from them and cringed, and was not ashamed to show this fear, for I saw the others doing the like, and knew that they were feeling those faint contacts too. As this went on, oh, eternities it seemed, the time dragged so drearily. All those faces became as wax, and I seemed sitting with a congress of the dead. At last, faint and far and weird and slow, came a boom, boom, boom. A distant bell tolling midnight. When the last stroke died, that depressing stillness followed again, and as before I was staring at those waxen faces and feeling those airy touches on my hair and my shoulders once more. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of this. Then we heard a long, deep groan, and everybody sprang up and stood, with his legs quaking. It came from that little dungeon. There was a pause. Then we heard muffled sobbings, mixed with pitiful ejaculations. Then there was a second voice, low and not distinct, and the one seemed trying to comfort the other. And so the two voices went on, with moanings and soft sobbings, and, the tones were so full of compassion and sorry and despair. Indeed, it made one's heart sore to hear it. "Come, we will smash that wall and set those poor captives free. Here, with your axe." The dwarf jumped forward, swinging his great axe with both hands, and others sprang for torches and brought them. Bang, wang, slam, smash went the ancient bricks, and there was a hole an ox could pass through. We plunged within and held up the torches. Nothing there but vacancy. On the floor lay a rusty sword and a rotten fan. Now you know all that I know. Take the pathetic relics, and weave about them the romance of the dungeon's long-vanished inmates as best you can. Chapter 20, Joan makes cowards brave victors. The next day Joan wanted to go against the enemy again, but it was a feast of the Ascension, and the Holy Council of bandit generals were too pious to be willing to profane it with bloodshed. But privately they profaned it with plottings, a sort of industry just in their line. They decided to do the only thing proper to do now in the new circumstances of the case, feign an attack on the most important Bastille on the Orleans side. And then, if the English weakened the far more important fortresses on the other side of the river to come to its help, cross in force and capture those works. This would give them the bridge and free communication with the Salon, which was French territory. They decided to keep this latter part of the program secret from Joan. Joan intruded and took them by surprise. She asked them what they were about and what they had resolved upon. They said they had resolved to attack the most important of the English bastilles on the Orleans side next morning, and there the spokesman stopped. Joan said, "Well, go on. There is nothing more. That is all." The bastard hesitated, and then began some rambling talk not quite germane to the question. Joan interrupted him and said, "That will not do. Good bastard, you have answered. Since the bastard is not able to mention any advantage to be gained by taking that Bastille and stopping there, it is not likely that any of you could better the matter. You waste much time here in inventing plans that lead to nothing, and making delays that are damage. Are you concealing something from me? Bastard, this council has a general plan. I take it, without going into details. What is it? It is the same it was in the beginning, 7 months ago, to get provisions for a long siege, then sit down and tire the English out. In the name of God, as if 7 months was not enough, you want to provide for a year of it. Now ye shall drop these pusillanimous dreams. The English shall go in 3 days. Several exclaimed, "Aye, General, be prudent." Be prudent and starve? Do you call that war? I tell you this, if you do not already know it. The new circumstances have changed the face of matters. The true point of attack has shifted. It is on the other side of the river now. One must take the fortifications that command the bridge. The English know that if we are not fools and cowards, we will try to do that. They are grateful for your piety in wasting this day. They will reinforce the bridge forts from this side tonight, knowing what ought to happen tomorrow. You have but lost a day and made our task harder, for we will cross and take the bridge forts. Bastard, tell me the truth. Does not this council know that there is no other course for us than the one I am speaking of? Dunois conceded that the council did know it to be the most desirable, but considered it impracticable, and he excused the council as well as he could by saying that anasmic as nothing was really and rationally to be hoped for but a long continuance of the siege and wearying out of the English. They were naturally a little afraid of Joan's impetuous notions. He said, "You see, we are sure that the waiting game is the best, whereas you would carry everything by storm." "That I would, and moreover that I will. You have my orders. Here and now, we will move upon the forts of the south bank tomorrow at dawn, and carry them by storm. Yes, carry them by storm." La Hire came clanking in, and heard the last remark. He cried out, "By my baton, that is the music I love to hear. Yes, that is the right time and the beautiful words. My general, we will carry them by storm." He saluted in his large way and came up and shook Joan by the hand. Some member of the council was heard to say, "It follows, then, that we must begin with the Bastille St. John, and that will give the English time to." Joan turned and said, "Give yourselves no uneasiness about the Bastille St. John. The English will know enough to retire from it, and fall back on the bridge bastilles when they see us coming." She added, with a touch of sarcasm, "Even a war council would know enough to do that itself." Then she took her leave. La Hire made this general remark to the council. Joan had spoken truly. The sagacious English saw that the policy of the French had undergone a revolution, that the policy of paltering and dawdling was ended, that in place of taking blows, blows were ready to be struck now. Therefore they made ready for the new state of things by transferring heavy reinforcements to the bastilles of the south bank from those of the north. The city learned the great news that once more in French history, after all these humiliating years, France was going to take the offensive, that France, so used to retreating, was going to advance, that France, so long accustomed to skulking, was going to face about and strike. The joy of the people passed all bounds. The city walls were black with them to see the army march out in the morning in its strange new position, its front, not its tail, toward an English camp. You shall imagine for yourselves what the excitement was like and how it expressed itself when Joan rode out at the head of the host with a banner floating above her. We moved down the shore and Joan planted her standard before the Bastille of the Augustines, the first of the formidable works that protected the end of the bridge. The trumpets sounded the assault, and 2 charges followed in handsome style, but we were too weak, as yet, for our main body was still lagging behind. Before we could gather for a third assault, the garrison of St. Prive was seen coming up to reinforce the big Bastille. They came on a run, and the Augustines sallied out, and both forces came against us with a rush, and sent our small army flying in a panic, and followed us, slashing and slaying, and shouting jeers and insults at us. Joan was doing her best to rally the men, but their wits were gone. Their hearts were dominated for the moment by the old-time dread of the English. Joan's temper flamed up, and she halted and commanded the trumpets to sound the advance. Then she wheeled about and cried out, "If there is but a dozen of you that are not cowards, it is enough. Follow me." Away she went, and after her a few dozen who had heard her words and been inspired by them. The pursuing force was astonished to see her sweeping down upon them with this handful of men, and it was their turn now to experience a grisly fright. Surely this is a witch. This is a child of Satan. That was their thought. And without stopping to analyze the matter, they turned and fled in a panic. La Hire heard it and hurried his force forward, and caught up with us just as we were planting our banner again before the ramparts of the Augustines. We were strong enough now. We had a long and tough piece of work before us, but we carried it through before night, Joan keeping us hard at it, and she and La Hire saying we were able to take that big Bastille, and must. The English fought well, they fought like the English. When that is said, there is no more to say. We made assault after assault, through the smoke and flame and the deafening cannon blasts, and at last as the sun was sinking we carried the place with a rush, and planted our standard on its walls. The Augustines was ours. The Tyrrells must be ours, too, if we would free the bridge and raise the siege. We had achieved one great undertaking. Joan was determined to accomplish the other. We must lie on our arms where we were, hold fast to what we had got, and be ready for business in the morning. So Joan was not minded to let the men be demoralized by pillage and riot and carousings. She had the Augustines burned, with all its stores in it, excepting the artillery and ammunition. Chapter 21, she gently reproves her dear friend. She was going on, when Catherine spoke up and said, "Ah, but it will fright her so to read these words. Strike them out, Joan, strike them out, and wait only 1 day, 2 days at most. Then write and say your foot was wounded but is well again, for it shall be well then, or very near it. Don't distress her, Joan, do as I say. Child, have you another wound and a worse, and have not spoken of it? What have you been dreaming about, that you... A wound which you are going to get? But why grieve your mother when it may not happen? May not? Why, it will." The puzzle was a puzzle still. Catherine said in that same abstracted way as before. "But it isn't presentiment, it is a fact, and it will not make me miserable. It is uncertainties that do that, but this is not an uncertainty. Joan, do you know it is going to happen?" "Yes, I know it. My voice has told me." "Ah," said Catherine resignedly, "if they told you, but are you sure it was they? Quite sure?" "Yes, quite. It will happen. There is no doubt." "It is dreadful. Since when have you know it?" "Since, I think it is several weeks." Joan turned to me. "Louis, you will remember. How long is it?" "Your Excellency spoke of it first to the king, in Chinon." I answered. "That was as much as 7 weeks ago. You spoke of it again the 20th of April, and also the 22d, 2 weeks ago, as I see by my record here." These marvels disturbed Catherine profoundly, but I had long ceased to be surprised at them. One can get used to anything in this world. Catherine said, "And it is to happen tomorrow, always tomorrow? Is it the same date always? There's been no mistake, and no confusion." "No," Joan said. "The 7th of May is the date. There is no other." "Then you shall not go a step out of this house till that awful day is gone by. You will not dream of it. Joan, will you? Promise that you will stay with us." But Joan was not persuaded. She said, "It would not help the matter, dear good friend. The wound is to come, and come tomorrow. If I do not seek it, it will seek me. My duty calls me to that place tomorrow. I should have to go if my death were waiting for me there. Shall I stay away for only a wound? Oh, no, we must try to do better than that." "Then you are determined to go?" "Of a certainty, yes. There is only one thing that I can do for France: harden her soldiers for battle and victory." She thought a moment, then added, "However, one should not be unreasonable, and I would do much to please you, who are so good to me. Do you love France?" I wondered what she might be contriving now, but I saw no clue. Catherine said, reproachfully, "Then you do love France." I had not doubted it. "Dear, do not be hurt, but answer me, have you ever told a lie?" "In my life I have not willfully told a lie, fibs, but no lies." "That is sufficient. You love France and do not tell lies. Therefore I will trust you. I will go or I will stay, as you shall decide." "Oh, I thank you from my heart. Joan, how good and dear it is of you to do this for me. Oh, you shall stay, and not go." "Then you will send word to my headquarters that I am not going." "Oh, gladly. Leave that to me." "It is good of you. And how will you word it? For it must have proper official form. Shall I word it for you?" "Oh, do. For you know about these solemn procedures and stately proprieties, and I have had no experience." "Then word it like this. The Chief of Staff is commanded to make known to the King's forces in garrison and in the field that the General-in-Chief of the armies of France will not face the English on the morrow, she being afraid she may get hurt. Signed, Joan of Arc, by the hand of Catherine Boucher, who loved France." There was a pause, a silence of the sort that tortures one into stealing a glance to see how the situation looks, and I did that. There was a loving smile on Joan's face, but the color was mounting in crimson waves into Catherine's, and her lips were quivering and the tears gathering. Then she said, "Joan did it well, and most sweetly and tenderly, but I could have done it as well, though I knew it would be foolish and out of place to suggest such a thing, and might make an awkwardness and be embarrassing to us all. So I did not offer, and I hope I did right and for the best, though I could not know, and was many times tortured with doubts afterward as having perhaps let a chance pass which might have changed all my life and made it happier and more beautiful than. Alas, it turned out to be. For this reason I grieve yet, when I think of that scene, and do not like to call it up out of the deeps of my memory because of the pangs it brings. Well, a good and wholesome thing is a little harmless fun in this world. It tones a body up and keeps him human, and prevents him from souring. To set that little trap for Catherine was as good and effective a way as any to show her what a grotesque thing she was asking of Joan. It was a funny idea now, wasn't it, when you look at it all around? Even Catherine dried up her tears and laughed when she thought of the English getting hold of the French commander-in-chief's reason for staying out of a battle. She granted that they could have a good time over a thing like that. We got to work on the letter again, and of course did not have to strike out the passage about the wound. Joan was in fine spirits, but when she got to sending messages to this, that, and the other playmate and friend, it brought our village and the fairy tree and the flowery plain and the browsing sheep and all the peaceful beauty of our old humble home place back, and the familiar names began to tremble on her lips. And when she got to Homet and Little Menjet, it was no use. Her voice broke and she couldn't go on. She waited a moment, then said, "Give them my love, my warm love, my deep love. Oh, out of my heart of hearts. I shall never see our home any more." Now came Pasquerel, Joan's confessor, and introduced a gallant knight, the Sieur de Ray, who had been sent with a message. He said he was instructed to say that the council had decided that enough had been done for the present, that it would be safest and best to be content with what God had already done, that the city was now well victualled and able to stand a long siege, that the wise course must necessarily be to withdraw the troops from the other side of the river and resume the defensive. Therefore they had decided accordingly. "The incurable cowards!" exclaimed Joan. "So it was to get me away from my men, that they pretended so much solicitude about my fatigue. Take this message back, not to the council. I have no speeches to those disguised ladies' maids, but to the bastard and La Hire, who are men. Tell them the army is to remain where it is, and I hold them responsible if this command miscarries. And say the offensive will be resumed in the morning. You may go, good sir." Then she said to her priest, "Rise early, and be by me all the day. There will be much work on my hands, and I shall be hurt between my neck and my shoulder." Chapter 22, The Fate of France Decided. We were up at dawn, and after Mass we started. In the hall we met the master of the house, who was grieved, good man, to see Joan going breakfastless to such a day's work, and begged her to wait and eat, but she couldn't afford the time. That is to say, she couldn't afford the patience, she being in such a blaze of anxiety to get that last remaining Bastille which stood between her and the completion of the first great step in the rescue and redemption of France. Boucher put in another plea. "But think, we poor beleaguered citizens who have hardly known the flavor of fish for these many months, have spoil of that sort again, and we owe it to you. There's a noble shad for breakfast. Wait, be persuaded." Joan said, "Ah, your excellency will do well, that I know, but we don't require quite that much, even of you. You shall have a month for it in place of a day. Now be beguiled, wait and eat. There's a saying that would cross a river twice in the same day in a boat will do well to eat fish for luck, lest he have an accident. That doesn't fit my case, for today I crossed but once in a boat." "Oh, don't say that. Aren't you coming back to us?" "How, then?" "By the bridge." "Listen to that, by the bridge. Now stop this jesting, dear General, and do as I would have done you. It's a noble fish. Be good, then, and save me some for supper, and I will bring one of those Englishmen with me, and he shall have his shay." Where is she going? Whither is she bound? You see, the council had closed the Burgundy gate and placed a strong force there, under that stout soldier Raoul de Gourcourt, Bailly of Orleans, with orders to prevent Joan from getting out and resuming the attack on the Tourelles, and this shameful thing had plunged the city into sorrow and despair. But that feeling was gone now. They believed the maid was a match for the council, and they were right. When we reached the gate, Joan told Gourcourt to open it and let her pass. He said it would be impossible to do this, for his orders were from the council and were strict. Joan said, "There is no authority above mine but the king's. If you have an order from the king, produce it." "I cannot claim to have an order from him, General." "Then make way, or take the consequences." He began to argue the case, for he was like the rest of the tribe, always ready to fight with words, not acts. But in the midst of his gabble, Joan interrupted with the terse order, "Charge!" We came with a rush, and brief work we made of that small job. It was good to see the Bailey's surprise. He was not used to this unsentimental promptness. He said afterward that he was cut off in the midst of what he was saying, in the midst of an argument by which it could have proved that he could not let Joan pass, an argument which Joan could not have answered. "Still, it appears she did answer it," said the person he was talking to. We swung through the gate in great style, with a vast succession of noise, the most of which was laughter, and soon our van was over the river and moving down against the Tourelles. First we must take a supporting work called a boulevard, and which was otherwise nameless, before we could assault the great Bastille. Its rear communicated with the Bastille by a drawbridge, under which ran a swift and deep strip of the Loire. The boulevard was strong, and Dunois doubted our ability to take it, but Joan had no such doubt. She pounded it with artillery all the forenoon. Then about noon she ordered an assault and led it herself. We poured into the fosse through the smoke and a tempest of missiles, and Joan, shouting encouragements to her men, started to climb a scaling ladder, when that misfortune happened which we knew was to happen. The iron bowl from an arquebus struck between her neck and her shoulder, and tore its way down through her armor. When she felt a sharp pain and saw her blood gushing over her breast, she was frightened, poor girl, and as she sank to the ground she began to cry bitterly. The English sent up a glad shout and came surging down in strong force to take her, and then for a few minutes the might of both adversaries was concentrated upon that spot. Over her and above her, English and French fought with desperation, for she stood for France. Indeed, she was France to both sides, whichever won her won France, and could keep it forever. Right there in that small spot, and in 10 minutes by the clock, the fate of France, for all time, was to be decided, and was decided. If the English had captured Joan then, Charles VII would have flown the country, the Treaty of Troyes would have held good, and France, already English property, would have become, without further dispute, an English province, to so remain until Judgment Day. A nationality and a kingdom were at stake there, and no more time to decide it than it takes to hard-boil an egg. It was the most momentous 10 minutes that the clock has ever ticked in France, or ever will. Whenever you read in histories about hours or days or weeks in which the fate of one or another nation hung in the balance, do not you fail to remember, nor your French hearts to beat the quicker for the remembrance, the 10 minutes that France, called otherwise Joan of Arc, lay bleeding in the fosse that day, with 2 nations struggling over her for her possession. And you will not forget the dwarf, for he stood over her, and did the work of any 6 of the others. He swung his axe with both hands. Whenever it came down, he said those 2 words, "For France," and a splintered helmet flew like eggshells, and the skull that carried it had learned its manners and would offend the French no more. He piled a bulwark of ironclad dead in front of him and fought from behind it, and at last when the victory was ours we closed about him, shielding him, and he ran up a ladder with Joan as easily as another man would carry a child, and bore her out of the battle, a great crowd following and anxious, for she was drenched with blood to her feet, half of it her own and the other half English, for bodies had fallen across her as she lay, and had poured their red life streams over her. One couldn't see the white armor now, with that awful dressing over it. Joan lay on the grass, weak and suffering, hour after hour, but still insisting that the fight go on, which it did, but not to much purpose, for it was only under her eye that men were heroes and not afraid. They were like the paladin. I think he was afraid of his shadow. I mean in the afternoon, when it was very big and long. But when he was under Joan's eye and the inspiration of a great spirit, what was he afraid of? Nothing in this world, and that is just the truth. What? She cried, sounding the retreat. Her wound was forgotten in a moment. She countermanded the order, and sent another, to the officer in command of a battery, to stand ready to fire 5 shots in quick succession. This was a signal to the force on the Orleans side of the river under La Haye, who was not, as some of the histories say, with us. It was to be given whenever Joan should feel sure the boulevard was about to fall into her hands. Then that force must make a counterattack on the Tourelles by way of the bridge. Joan mounted her horse now, with her staff about her, and when our people saw us coming they raised a great shout, and were at once eager for another assault on the boulevard. Joan rode straight to the fosse where she had received a wound, and standing there in the rain of bolts and arrows, she ordered the paladin to let her long standard blow free, and to note when its fringes should touch the fortress. Presently he said, "It touches." "Now, then," said Joan to the waiting battalions, "the place is yours. Enter in. Bugles, sound the assault. Now, then, all together. Go." We were busy and never heard the 5 cannon shots fired, but they were fired a moment after Joan had ordered the assault. And so, while we were hammering and being hammered in the smaller fortress, the reserve on the Orleans side poured across the bridge and attacked the Tourelles from that side. A fireboat was brought down and moored under the drawbridge which connected the Tourelles with our boulevard. Wherefore, when at last we drove our English ahead of us, and they tried to cross that drawbridge and join their friends in the Tourelles, the burning timbers gave way under them and emptied them in a mass into the river in their heavy armor, and a pitiful sight it was to see brave men die such a death as that. "Aye, God pity them," said Joan, and wept to see that sorrowful spectacle. She said those gentle words and wept those compassionate tears, although one of those perishing men had grossly insulted her with a coarse name 3 days before, when she had sent him a message asking him to surrender. That was their leader, Sir Williams Glassdale, a most valorous knight. He was clothed all in steel, so he plunged under water like a lance, and of course came up no more. We soon patched a sort of bridge together and threw ourselves against the last stronghold of the English power that barred Orleans from friends and supplies. Before the sun was quite down, Joan's forever memorable day's work was finished. Her banner floated from the fortress of the Tourelles. Her promise was fulfilled. She had raised the siege of Orleans. The 7 months' beleaguerment was ended. The thing which the first generals of France had called impossible was accomplished, in spite of all that the king's ministers and war councils could do to prevent it. This little country maid at 17 had carried her immortal task through, and had done it in 4 days. Good news travels fast, sometimes, as well as bad. By the time we were ready to start homeward by the bridge, the whole city of Orleans was one red flame of bonfires, and the heavens blushed with satisfaction to see it. And the booming and bellowing of cannon and the banging of bells surpassed by great odds anything that even Orleans had attempted before in the way of noise. When we arrived, well, there's no describing that. Why, those acres of people that we plowed through shed tears enough to raise the river. There was not a face in the glare of those fires that hadn't tears streaming down it, and if Joan's feet had not been protected by iron, they would have kissed them off of her. "Welcome, welcome to the Maid of Orleans." That was the cry. I heard it 100,000 times. "Welcome to our maid," some of them worded it. No other girl in all history has ever reached such a summit of glory as Joan of Arc reached that day. And do you think it turned her head, and that she sat up to enjoy that delicious music of homage and applause? No, another girl would have done that, but not this one. That was the greatest heart, and the simplest that ever beat. She went straight to bed and to sleep, like any tired child. And when the people found she was wounded and would rest, they shut off all passage and traffic in that region, and stood guard themselves the whole night through, to see that his slumbers were not disturbed. They said, "She has given us peace. She shall have peace herself." All knew that that region would be empty of English next day, and all said that neither the present citizens nor their posterity would ever cease to hold that day sacred to the memory of Joan of Arc. That word has been true for more than 60 years. It will continue so always. Orleans will never forget the 8th of May, nor ever fail to celebrate it. It is Joan of Arc's day, and holy. 1, Chapter 23. Joan inspires the tawdry king. The city emptied itself. Out of every gate the crowds poured. They swarmed about the English bastilles like an invasion of ants, but noisier than those creatures, and carried off the artillery and stores, then turned all those dozen fortresses into monster bonfires, imitation volcanoes whose lofty columns of thick smoke seemed supporting the arch of the sky. The delight of the children took another form. To some of the younger ones, 7 months was a sort of lifetime. They had forgotten what grass was like, and the velvety green meadows seemed paradise to their surprised and happy eyes after the long habit of seeing nothing but dirty lanes and streets. It was a wonder to them, those spacious reaches of open country to run and dance and tumble and frolic in after their dull and joyless captivity. So they scampered far and wide over the fair regions on both sides of the river, and came back at eventide weary, but laden with flowers and flushed with new health drawn from the fresh country air and the vigorous exercise. After the burnings, the grown folk followed Joan from church to church and put in the day in thanksgiving for the city's deliverance, and at night they fêted her and her generals and illuminated the town, and high and low gave themselves up to festivities and rejoicings. By the time the populace were fairly in bed, toward dawn, we were in the saddle and away toward Tours to report to the king. That was a march which would have turned anyone's head but Joan's. We moved between emotional ranks of grateful country people all the way. They crowded about Joan to touch her feet, her horse, her armor, and they even knelt in the road and kissed her horse's hoofprints. The land was full of her praises. The most illustrious chiefs of the church wrote to the king extolling the maid, comparing her to the saints and heroes of the Bible, and warning him not to let unbelief, ingratitude, or other injustice hinder or impair the divine help sent through her. One might think there was a touch of prophecy in that, and we will let it go at that. But to my mind it had its inspiration in those great men's accurate knowledge of the king's trivial and treacherous character. The king had come to Tours to meet Joan. At the present day, this poor thing is called Charles the Victorious, on account of victories which other people won for him. But in our time we had a private name for him which described him better, and was sanctified to him by personal deserving, Charles the Base. When we entered the presence, he sat throned, with his tinsel snobs and dandies around him. He looked like a forked carrot, so tightly did his clothing fit him from his waist down. He wore shoes with a rope-like pliant toe a foot long that had to be hitched up to the knee to keep it out of the way. He had on a crimson velvet cape that came no lower than his elbows. On his head he had a tall felt thing like a thimble, with a feather in its jeweled band that stuck up like a pen from an inkhorn, and from under that thimble his bush of stiff hay stuck down to his shoulders, curving outward at the bottom, so that the cap and the hay together made the head like a shuttlecock. All the materials of his dress were rich, and all the colors brilliant. In his lap he cuddled a miniature greyhound that snarled, lifting its lip, and showing its white teeth whenever any slight movement disturbed it. The king's dandies were dressing about the same fashion as himself, and when I remembered that Joan had called the war council of Orleans disguised ladies' maids, it reminded me of people who squander all their money on a trifle and then haven't anything to invest when they come across a better chance. That name ought to have been saved for these creatures. Joan fell on her knees before the majesty of France, and the other frivolous animal in his lap, a sight which it pained me to see. What had that man done for his country or for anybody in it, that she or any other person should kneel to him? But she had just done the only great deed that had been done for France in 50 years, and had consecrated it with a libation of her blood. The position should have been reversed. However, to be fair, one must grant that Charles acquitted himself very well for the most part, on that occasion, very much better than he was in the habit of doing. He passed his pup to a courtier, and took off his cap to Joan as if she had been a queen. Then he stepped from his throne and raised her, and showed quite a spirited and manly joy and gratitude in welcoming her and thanking her for her extraordinary achievement in his service. My prejudices are of a later date than that. If he had continued as he was at that moment, I should not have acquired them. He acted handsomely. He said, "You shall not kneel to me, my matchless general. You have wrought royally, and royal courtesies are your due." Noticing that she was pale, he said, "But you must not stand. You have lost blood for France, and your wound is yet green. Come." He led her to a seat and sat down by her. "Now, then, Speak out frankly, as to one who owes you much and freely confesses it before all this courtly assemblage. What shall be your reward? Name it. I was ashamed of him. And yet that was not Fay. For how could it be expected to know this marvelous child in these few weeks, when we thought we had known her all her life, would daily seeing the clouds uncover some new altitudes of a character whose existence was not suspected by us before? But we are all that way, when we know a thing we have only scorned for other people who don't happen to know it. And I was ashamed of these courtiers, too, for the way they licked their chops, so to speak, as envying Joan her great chance, they not knowing her any better than the king did. A blush began to rise in Joan's cheeks at the thought that she was working for her country for pay, and she dropped her head and tried to hide her face, as girls always do when they find themselves blushing. No one knows why they do, but they do. And the more they blush, the more they fail to get reconciled to it, and the more they can't bear to have people look at them when they are doing it. The king made it a great deal worse by calling attention to it, which is the unkindest thing a person can do when a girl is blushing. Sometimes, when there's a big crowd of strangers, it is even likely to make her cry if she is as young as Joan was. God knows the reason for this. It is hidden from men. As for me, I would as soon blush as sneeze. In fact, I would rather. However, these meditations are not of consequence. I will go on with what I was saying. The king rallied her for blushing, and this brought up the rest of the blood and turned her face to fire. Then he was sorry, seeing what he had done, and tried to make her comfortable by saying the blush was exceeding becoming to her and not to mind it, which caused even the dog to notice it now. So of course the red in Joan's face turned to purple, and the tears overflowed and ran down. I could have told anybody that that would happen. The king was distressed, and saw that the best thing to do would be to get away from this subject. So he began to say the finest kind of things about Joan's capture of the Tyrrells, and presently when she was more composed he mentioned the reward again and pressed her to name it. Everybody listened with anxious interest to hear what her claim was going to be, but when her answer came their faces showed that the thing she asked for was not what they had been expecting. Oh, dear and gracious Dauphin, I have but one desire, only one. Do not be afraid, my child, name it, that you will not delay a day. My army is strong and valiant, and eager to finish its work. March with me to Rheims and receive your crown. You could see the indolent king shrink, in his butterfly clothes. To Rheims? Oh, impossible, my general. We march through the heart of England's power. Ah, I pray you do not throw away this perfect opportunity. Everything is favorable, everything. It is as if the circumstances were specially made for it. The spirits of our army are exalted with victory, those of the English forces depressed by defeat. Delay will change this. Seeing us hesitate to follow up our advantage, our men will wonder, doubt, lose confidence, and the English will wonder, gather courage, and be bold again. Now is the time. Prithee let us march. The king shook his head, and La Tremouille, being asked for an opinion, eagerly furnished it. Sire, all prudence is against it. Think of the English strongholds along the Loire. Think of those that lie between us and Rheims. If we wait, they will all be strengthened, reinforced. Will that advantage us? Why, no. Then what is your suggestion? What is it that you would propose to do? My judgment is to wait. Wait for what? The minister was obliged to hesitate, for he knew of no explanation that would sound well. Moreover, he was not used to being catechized in this fashion, with the eyes of a crowd of people on him. So he was irritated, and said, Matters of state are not proper matters for public discussion. Joan said placidly, I have to beg your pardon. My trespass came of ignorance. I did not know that matters connected with your department of the government were matters of state. The minister lifted his brows in amused surprise and said, with a touch of sarcasm. Joan replied indifferently, No state. No, sir, there is no state and no use for minister. France is shrunk to a couple of acres of ground. A sheriff's constable could take care of it. Its affairs are not matters of state. The term is too large. The king did not blush, but burst into a hearty, careless laugh, and the court laughed too, but prudently turned its head and did it silently. La Tremouille was angry and opened his mouth to speak, but the king put up his hand and said. It made an eager buzz of surprise and envy in the assemblage, but Joan shook her head and said, "Ah, I cannot, dear and noble Dauphin, to be allowed to work for France, to spend oneself for France, is itself so supreme a reward that nothing can add to it, nothing. Give me the one reward I ask, the dearest of all rewards, the highest in your gift. March with me to Reims and receive your crown. I will beg it on my knees." But the king put his hand on her arm, and there was a really brave awakening in his voice and a manly fire in his eye when he said, "No, sit. You have conquered me. It shall be as you." But a warning sign from his minister halted him, and he added, to the relief of the court, Well, we will think of it. We will think it over and see. Does that content you, impulsive little soldier?" The first part of the speech sent a glow of delight to Joan's face, but the end of it quenched it, and she looked sad, and the tears gathered in her eyes. After a moment she spoke out with what seemed a sort of terrified impulse, and said, "But little time. Only a year. I shall last only a year. Why, child, there are 50 good years in that compact little body yet." "Oh, you err. Indeed you do. In one little year the end will come." "Aye, the time is so short, the moments are flying, and so much to be done. Oh, use me, and quickly. It is life or death for France." Even those insects were sobered by her impassioned words. The king looked very grave, and strongly impressed. His eyes lit suddenly with an eloquent fire, and he rose and drew his sword and raised it aloft. Then he brought it slowly down upon Joan's shoulder and said, "Ah, thou art so simple, so true, so great, so noble, and by this accolade I join thee to the nobility of France, thy fitting place. And for thy sake I do hereby ennoble all thy family and all thy kin, and all their descendants born in wedlock, not only in the male but also in the female line. And more, to distinguish thy house and honor it above all others, we add a privilege never accorded to any before in the history of these dominions. The females of thy line shall have and hold the right to ennoble their husbands when these shall be of inferior degree." Astonishment and envy flared up in every countenance when the words were uttered which conferred this extraordinary grace. The king paused and looked around upon these signs with quite evident satisfaction. "Rise, Joan of Arc, now and henceforth surnamed Dulies, in grateful acknowledgment of the good blow which you have struck for the lilies of France, and they, and the royal crown, and your own victorious sword, fit and fair company for each other, shall be grouped in your escutcheon and be and remain the symbol of your high nobility forever." As my Lady Dulies rose, the gilded children of privilege pressed forward to welcome her to their sacred ranks and call her by her new name. But she was troubled, and said these honors were not meet for one of a lowly birth and station, and by their kind grace she would remain simple Joan of Arc, nothing more, and so be called. Chapter 24. Tinsel Trappings of Nobility. It was vexatious to see what it to do the whole town, and next the whole country, made over the news. Joan of Arc ennobled by the king. People went dizzy with wonder and delight over it. You cannot imagine how she was gaped at, stared at, envied. Why, one would have supposed that some great and fortunate thing had happened to her. But we did not think any great things of it. To our minds, no mere human hand could add a glory to Joan of Arc. To us she was the sun soaring in the heavens, and her new nobility a candle atop of it. To us it was swallowed up and lost in her own light, and she was as indifferent to it and as unconscious of it as the other sun would have been. But it was different with her brothers. They were proud and happy in their new dignity, which was quite natural, and Joan was glad it had been conferred when she saw how pleased they were. It was a clever thought in the king to outflank her scruples by marching on them under shelter of her love for her family and her kin. Jane and Pierre sported their coats of arms right away, and their society was courted by everybody, the nobles and commons alike. The standard-bearer said, with some touch of bitterness, that he could see that they just felt good to be alive. They were so soaked with the comfort of their glory, and didn't like to sleep at all, because when they were asleep they didn't know they were noble, and so sleep was a clean loss of time. And then he said, They can't take precedence of me in military functions and state ceremonies, but when it comes to civil ones and society affairs, I judge they'll cuddle coolly and behind you in the nights, and I will have to walk behind them. Hey. Yes, I said, I think you are right. I was just afraid of it, said the standard bearer with a sigh. Afraid of it? I'm talking like a fool. Of course I knew it. Yes, I was talking like a fool. No, Raingesson said, musingly. Yes, I noticed something natural about the tone of it. We others laughed. The Sieur de Met said, Paladin, your fears haven't reached the top notch. They are way below the grand possibilities. Didn't it occur to you that in civil and society functions they will take precedence of all the rest of the personal staff, every one of us? Oh, come. You'll find it so. Look at their escutcheon. Its chiefest feature is the lilies of France. It's royal. Man, royal. Do you understand the size of that? The lilies are there by authority of the king. Do you understand the size of that? Though not in detail and in entirety, they do nevertheless substantially quarter the arms of France in their coat. Imagine it. Consider it. Measure the magnitude of it. We walk in front of those boys. Bless you. We've done that for the last time. In my opinion, there isn't a lay lord in this whole region that can walk in front of them, except the Duke d'Alencon, Prince of the Blood. You could have knocked the paladin down with a feather. He seemed to actually turn pale. He worked his lips a moment without getting anything out. Then it came. I didn't know that, nor the half of it. How could I? I've been an idiot. I see it now. I've been an idiot. I met them this morning, and sung out hello to them just as I would to anybody. I didn't mean to be ill-mannered, but I didn't know the half of this that you've been telling. I've been an ass. Yes, that is all there is to it. I've been an ass. No, Raingesson said, in a kind of weary way. You don't you? Well, why don't you? Because I don't see any novelty about it. With some people, it is a condition which is present all the time. Now you take a condition which is present all the time, and the results of that condition will be uniform. This uniformity of result will in time become monotonous. Monotonousness, by the law of its being, is fatiguing. If you had manifested fatigue upon noticing that you had been an ass, that would have been logical, that would have been rational. Whereas it seems to me that to manifest surprise was to be again an ass, because a condition of intellect that can enable a person to be surprised and stirred by inert monotonousness is a... Now that is enough. No, Raingesson. Stop where you are before you get yourself into trouble. And don't bother me any more for some days or week, and it please you, for I cannot abide your clack. Come, I like that. I didn't want to talk. I tried to get out of talking. If you didn't want to hear my clack, what did you keep intruding your conversation on me for? I never dreamed of such a thing. Well, you did it, anyway. And I have a right to feel hurt, and I do feel hurt, to have you treat me so. It seems to me that when a person goads and crowds and in a manner forces another person to talk, it is neither very fair nor very good-mannered to call what he says clack. What thing? Why, that Jean and Pierre are going to take precedence of all the lay noblesse hereabouts except the Duke d'Alencon. The standard bearer was deep in thoughts and dreams a few moments. Then the silken velvet expanse of his vast breast rose and fell with a sigh, and he said, Day, what a lift it is. It just shows what luck can do. Well, I don't care. I shouldn't care to be a painted accident. I shouldn't value it. I am prouder to have climbed up to where I am just by sheer natural merit than I would be to ride the very sun in the zenith, and have to reflect that I was nothing but a poor little accident, and got shot up there out of somebody else's catapult. To me, merit is everything. In fact, the only thing. All else is dross. Chapter 25 at last. Forward. The days began to waste away, and nothing decided, nothing done. The army was full of zeal, but it was also hungry. It got no pay. The treasury was getting empty. It was becoming impossible to feed it. Under pressure of privation, it began to fall apart and disperse, which pleased the trifling court exceedingly. Joan's distress was pitiful to see. She was obliged to stand helpless while a victorious army dissolved away until hardly the skeleton of it was left. Noble Dauphin, prithee hold no more of these long and numerous councils, but come, and come quickly, to Rheims and receive your crown. Christophe de Harcourt asked, is it your voices that command you to say that to the king? Yes, and urgently. Then will you not tell us in the king's presence in what way the voices communicate with you? It was another sly attempt to trap Joan into indiscreet admissions and dangerous pretensions, but nothing came of it. Joan's answer was simple and straightforward, and the smooth bishop was not able to find any fault with it. She said that when she met with people who doubted the truth of a mission, she went aside and prayed, complaining of the distrust of these, and then the comforting voices were heard at her ears saying, soft and low, go forward, daughter of God, and I will help thee. Then she added, when I hear that, the joy in my heart, oh, it is insupportable. Joan pleaded, persuaded, reasoned, gaining ground little by little, but opposed step by the council. She begged, she implored, leave to march. When they could answer nothing further, they granted that perhaps it had been a mistake to let the army waste away. But how could we help it now? How could we march without an army? But it will take 6 weeks. No matter, begin, let us begin. It is too late. Without doubt the Duke of Bedford has been gathering troops to push to the succor of his strongholds on the Loire. Yes, while we have been disbanding ours, and pity tease, but we must throw away no more time. We must bestir ourselves. The king objected that he could not venture toward Rheims with those strong places on the Loire in his path. But Joan said, we will break them up. Then you can march. With that plan, the king was willing to venture assent. He could sit around out of danger while the road was being cleared. Joan came back in great spirits. Straightway everything was stirring. Proclamations were issued calling for men. A recruiting camp was established at Selles and Berry, and the commons and the nobles began to flock to it with enthusiasm. A deal of the month of May had been wasted, and yet by the 6th of June Joan had swept together a new army and was ready to march. She had 8,000 men. Think of that. Think of gathering together such a body as that in that little region. And these were veteran soldiers, too. In fact, most of the men in France were soldiers, when you came to that, for the wars had lasted generations now. Yes, most Frenchmen were soldiers, and admirable runners, too, both by practice and inheritance. They had done next to nothing but run for near a century. But that was not their fault. They had had no fair and proper leadership, at least leaders with a fair and proper chance. Away back, king and court got the habit of being treacherous to the leaders. Then the leaders easily got the habit of disobeying the king and going their own way, each for himself and nobody for the lot. Nobody could win victories that way. Hence, running became the habit of the French troops, and no wonder. Yet all that those troops needed in order to be good fighters was a leader who would attend strictly to business. A leader with all authority in his hands in place of a tenth of it, along with 9 other generals equipped with an equal tenth apiece. They had a leader rightly clothed with authority now, and with a head and heart bent on war, the most intensely businesslike and earnest sort. And there would be results. No doubt of that. They had Joan of Arc, and under that leadership their legs would lose the art and mystery of running. Yes, Joan was in great spirits. She was here and there and everywhere, all over the camp, by day and by night, pushing things. And wherever she came charging down the lines, reviewing the troops, it was good to hear them break out and cheer. And nobody could help cheering. She was such a vision of young bloom and beauty and grace, and such an incarnation of pluck and life and go. She was growing more and more ideally beautiful every day, as was plain to be seen, and these were days of development, for she was well past 17 now. In fact, she was getting close upon 17 and a half. Indeed, just a little woman, as you may say. The 2 young Counts de Laval arrived one day, fine young fellows allied to the greatest and most illustrious houses of France, and they could not rest till they had seen Joan of Arc. So the king sent for them and presented them to her, and you may believe she filled the bill of their expectations. When they heard that rich voice of hers, they must have thought it was a flute, and when they saw her deep eyes and her face, and the soul that looked out of that face. You could see that the sight of her stirred them like a poem, like lofty eloquence, like martial music. One of them wrote home to his people, and in his letter he said, "It seemed something divine to see her and hear her." Ah, yes, and it was a true word. Truer word was never spoken. He saw her when she was ready to begin her march and open the campaign, and this is what he said about it. She was clothed all in white armor save her head, and in her hand she carried a little battle axe. And when she was ready to mount her great black horse, he reared and plunged and would not let her. Then she said, "Lead him to the cross." This cross was in front of the church close by. So they led him there. Then she mounted, and he never budged, any more than if he had been tied. Then she turned toward the door of the church and said, in a soft womanly voice, "You, priests and people of the church, make processions and pray to God for us." Then she spurred away, under her standard, with a little axe in her hand, crying forward, "March!" One of her brothers, who came 8 days ago, departed with her, and he also was clad all in white armor. I was there, and I saw it, too, saw it all, just as he pictures it. And I see it yet, the little battle axe, the dainty plume cap, the white armor, all in the soft June afternoon. I see it just as if it were yesterday. And I rode with the staff, the personal staff, the staff of Joan of Arc. That young count was dying to go, too, but the king held him back for the present. But Joan had made him a promise. In his letter he said, "She told me that when the king starts for Reims, I shall go with him. But God grant I may not have to wait till then, but may have a part in the battles." She made him that promise when she was taking leave of my lady the Duchess d'Alencon. The Duchess was exacting a promise, so it seemed a proper time for others to do the like. The Duchess was troubled for her husband, for she foresaw desperate fighting, and she held Joan to her breast and stroked her hair lovingly and said, "You must watch over him, dear, and take care of him, and send him back to me safe. I require it of you. I will not let you go till you promise." Joan said, "I give you the promise with all my heart, and it is not just words, it is a promise. You shall have him back without a hurt. Do you believe? And are you satisfied with me now?" The Duchess could not speak, but she kissed Joan on the forehead, and so they parted. We left on the 6th and stopped over at Romorantin. When on the 9th Joan entered Orleans in state, under triumphal arches, with a welcoming cannon thundering and seas of welcoming flags fluttering in the breeze. The grand staff rode with her, clothed in shining splendors of costume and decorations. The Duc d'Alencon, the bastard of Orleans, the Sire de Boussac, Marshal of France, the Lord de Granville, Master of the Crossbowmen, the Sire de Coulon, Admiral of France, Ambrose de Law, Etienne de Vignoles, Cole La Hire, Gautier de Brusac, and other illustrious captains. It was grand times, the usual shoutings and packed multitudes, the usual crush to get sight of Joan, but at last we crowded through to our old lodgings, and I saw old Boucher and the wife and that dear Catherine gather Joan to their hearts and smother her with kisses, and my heart ached for her so, for I could have kissed Catherine better than anybody, and more and longer, yet was not thought of for that office, and I so famished for it. Ah! She was so beautiful, and oh, so sweet. I had loved her the first day I ever saw her, and from that day forth she was sacred to me. Chapter 26, The Last Outscattered. This time, as before, the king's last command to the generals was this: "See to it that you do nothing without the sanction of the Maid." And this time the command was obeyed, and would continue to be obeyed all through the coming great days of the Loire campaign. That was a change. That was new. It broke the traditions. It shows you what sort of a reputation as a commander-in-chief the child had made for herself in 10 days in the field. It was a conquering of men's doubts and suspicions, and a capturing and solidifying of men's belief and confidence such as the greyest veteran on the grand staff had not been able to achieve in 30 years. Don't you remember that when at 16 Joan conducted her own case in a grim court of law and won it, the old judge spoke of her as this marvelous child? It was the right name, you see. These veterans were not going to branch out and do things without the sanction of the Maid. That is true, and it was a great gain. But at the same time, there were some among them who still trembled at her new and dashing war tactics and earnestly desired to modify them. And so, during the 10th, while Joan was slaving away at her plans and issuing order after order with tireless industry, the old-time consultations and arguings and speechifyings were going on among certain of the generals. In the afternoon of that day, they came in a body to hold one of these councils of war, and while they waited for Joan to join them, they discussed the situation. Now this discussion is not set down in the histories, but I was there, and I will speak of it, as knowing you will trust me, I not being given to beguiling you with lies. Gautier de Brusac was spokesman for the timid ones. Joan's side was resolutely upheld by d'Alencon, the Bastard, La Haye, the Admiral of France, the Marshal de Boussac, and all the other really important chiefs. De Brusac argued that the situation was very grave, that Jadot, the first point of attack, was formidably strong, its imposing walls bristling with artillery, with 7,000 picked English veterans behind them, and at their head the great Earl of Suffolk and his two redoubtable brothers, the de la Poles. It seemed to him that the proposal of Joan of Arc to try to take such a place by storm was a most rash and over-daring idea, and she ought to be persuaded to relinquish it in favor of the soberer and safer procedure of investment by regular siege. It seemed to him that this fiery and furious new fashion of hurling masses of men against impregnable walls of stone, in defiance of the established laws and usages of war, was. But he got no further. La Haye gave his plumed helm an impatient toss and burst out with, "By God, she knows her trade, and none can teach it her." And before he could get out anything more, d'Alencon was on his feet, and the Bastard of Orleans, and a half a dozen others, all thundering at once, and pouring out their indignant displeasure upon any and all that might hold, secretly or publicly, distrust of the wisdom of the commander-in-chief. And when they had said their say, La Haye took a chance again, and said, "There are some that never know how to change. Circumstances may change, but those people are never able to see that they have got to change to meet those circumstances. All that they know is the one beaten track that their fathers and grandfathers have followed, and that they themselves have followed in their turn. If an earthquake come and rip the land to chaos, and that beaten track now lead over precipices and into morasses, those people can't learn that they must strike out a new road. No, they will march stupidly along and follow the old one, to death and perdition. Men, there's a new state of things, and a surpassing military genius has perceived it with a clear eye, and a new road is required, and that same clear eye has noted where it must go, and has marked it out for us. The man does not live, never has lived, never will live, that can improve upon it. The old state of things was defeat, 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 and by consequence we had troops with no dash, no heart, no hope. Would you assault stone walls with such? No, there was but one way with that kind. Sit down before a place and wait. Wait, starve it out, if you could. The new case is the very opposite. It is this: men all on fire with pluck and dash and vim and fury and energy, a restrained conflagration. What would you do with it? Hold it down and let it smolder and perish and go out? What would Joan of Arc do with it? Turn it loose, by the Lord God of heaven and earth, and let it swallow up a foe in the whirlwind of its fires. Nothing shows the splendor and wisdom of a military genius like an instant comprehension of the size of the change which has come about, and an instant perception of the right and only right way to take advantage of it. With her is no sitting down and starving out, no dilly-dallying and fooling around, no lazying, loafing, and going to sleep. No, it is storm, 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 and still storm, 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 and forever storm, storm, storm. Hunt the enemy to his hole, then turn her French hurricanes loose and carry him by storm. And that is my sort. Jadot? What of Jadot? With its battlements and towers, its devastating artillery, its 7,000 picked veterans. Joan of Arc is to the fore, and by the splendor of God its fate is sealed. Oh, he carried them. There was not another word said about persuading Joan to change her tactics. They sat talking comfortably enough after that. By and by Joan entered, and they rose and saluted with their swords, and she asked what their pleasure might be. La Haye said, "It is settled, my general. The matter concerned Jadot. There were some who thought we could not take the place. Joan laughed a pleasant laugh, her merry, carefree laugh, the laugh that rippled so buoyantly from her lips and made old people feel young again to hear it. And she said to the company, "Have no fears. Indeed, there is no need nor any occasion for them. We will strike the English boldly by assault, and you will see." Then a faraway look came into her eyes, and I think that a picture of her home drifted across a vision of her mind. For she said very gently, and as one who muses, "But that I know God guides us and will give us success, I had liefer keep sheep than endure these perils." We had a home-like farewell supper that evening, just the personal staff and the family. Joan had to miss it, for the city had given a banquet in her honor, and she had gone there in state with the grand staff, through a riot of joy bells and a sparkling Milky Way of illuminations. After supper, some lively young folk whom we knew came in, and we presently forgot that we were soldiers, and only remembered that we were boys and girls and full of animal spirits and long-pent fun. And so there was dancing, and games, and romps, and screams of laughter, just as extravagant and innocent and noisy a good time as ever I had in my life. How long ago it was, and I was young then. And outside, all the while, was the measured tramp of marching battalions, belated odds and ends of the French power gathering for the morrow's tragedy on the grim stage of war. Yes, in those days we had those contrasts side by side. Chapter 27, How Joan Took Jargeau. We made a gallant show next day when we filed out through the frowning gates of Orleans, with banners flying and Joan and the grand staff in the van of the long column. Those 2 young de Lavals were come now, and were joined to the grand staff, which was well being their proper trade, for they were grandsons of that illustrious fighter Bertrand du Guesclin, Constable of France in earlier days. Louis de Bourbon, the Marshal de Ray, and the Vidame de Chartres were added also. We had a right to feel a little uneasy, for we knew that a force of 5,000 men was on its way under Sir John Fastolf to reinforce Jargeau, but I think we were not uneasy, nevertheless. In truth, that force was not yet in our neighborhood. Sir John was loitering. For some reason or other he was not hurrying. He was losing precious time, for days at Étampes and 4 more at Janville. We reached Jargeau and began business at once. Joan sent forward a heavy force which hurled itself against the outworks in handsome style, and gained a footing and fought hard to keep it. But it presently began to fall back before a sortie from the city. Seeing this, Joan raised a battle cry and led a new assault herself under furious artillery fire. The fight, we knew that all was well. We reached Jargeau and began business at once. Joan sent forward a heavy force which hurled itself against the outworks in handsome style, and gained a footing and fought hard to keep it. But it presently began to fall back before a sortie from the city. Seeing this, Joan raised a battle cry and led a new assault herself under a furious artillery fire. At last a great shout went up, a joyous roar of shoutings, in fact, and that was sign sufficient that the faubourgs were ours. Yes, they were ours. The enemy had been driven back within the walls. On the ground which Joan had won we camped, for night was coming on. Joan sent a summons to the English, promising that if they surrendered she would allow them to go in peace and take their horses with them. Nobody knew that she could take that strong place, but she knew it well. Yet she offered that grace, offered it in a time when such a thing was unknown in war, in a time when it was custom and usage to massacre the garrison and the inhabitants of captured cities without pity or compunction. Yes, even to the hamless women and children sometimes. There are neighbors all about you who well remember the unspeakable atrocities which Charles the Bold inflicted upon the men and women and children of Dinant when he took that place some years ago. It was a unique and kindly grace which Joan offered the garrison, but that was her way. That was a loving and merciful nature. She always did her best to save her enemy's life and his soldierly pride when she had the mastery of him. The English asked 15 days' armistice to consider the proposal in, and Fastolf coming with 5,000 men. Joan said no, but she offered another grace. They might take both their horses and their sidearms, but they must go within the hour. Work, and God will work with us. Yes, one might say that her motto was work. Stick to it. Keep on working, for in war she never knew what indolence was. And whoever will take that motto and live by it will likely to succeed. There's many a way to win in this world, but none of them is worth much without good hard work back out of it. I think we should have lost our big standard-bearer that day, if our bigger dwarf had not been at hand to bring him out of the melee when he was wounded. He was unconscious, and would have been trampled to death by our own horse, if the dwarf had not promptly rescued him and haled him to the rear in safety. He recovered, and was himself again after 2 or 3 hours, and then he was happy and proud, and made the most of his wound, and went swaggering around in his bandages showing off like an innocent big child, which was just what he was. He was prouder of being wounded than a really modest person would be of being killed. But there was no harm in his vanity, and nobody minded it. He said he was hit by a stone from a catapult, a stone the size of a man's head. But the stone grew, of course. Before he got through with it, he was claiming that the enemy had flung a building at him. "Let him alone," said Noel Rangessen. "Don't interrupt his processes. Tomorrow it will be a cathedral." Joan was abroad at the crack of dawn, galloping here and there and yonder, examining the situation minutely, and choosing what she considered the most effective positions for her artillery. And with such accurate judgment did she place her guns that a lieutenant general's admiration of it still survived in his memory when his testimony was taken at the rehabilitation, a quarter of a century later. In this testimony, the Duke d'Alencon said that at Jijou that morning of the 12th of June she made her dispositions not like a novice, but with the sure and clear judgment of a trained general of 20 or 30 years' experience. The veteran captains of the armies of France said she was great in war in all ways, but greatest of all in her genius for posting and handling artillery. Who taught the shepherd girl to do these marvels? She who could not read, and had no opportunity to study the complex arts of war. I do not know any way to solve such a baffling riddle as that, there being no precedent for it, nothing in history to compare it with and examine it by. For in history there is no great general, however gifted, who arrived at success otherwise than through able teaching and hard study and some experience. It is a riddle which will never be guessed. I think these vast powers and capacities were born in her, and that she applied them by an intuition which could not err. At 8 o'clock all movement ceased, and with it all sounds, all noise. A mute expectancy reigned. The stillness was something awful, because it meant so much. There was no air stirring. The flags on the towers and ramparts hung straight down like tassels. Wherever one saw a person, that person had stopped what he was doing, and was in a waiting attitude, a listening attitude. We were on a commanding spot, clustered around Joan. Not far from us, on every hand, were the lanes and humble dwellings of these outlying suburbs. Many people were visible. All were listening. Not one was moving. A man had placed a nail. He was about to fasten something with it to the doorpost of his shop, but he had stopped. There was his hand reaching up holding the nail, and there was his other hand in the act of striking with the hammer, but he had forgotten everything. His head was turned aside listening. Even children unconsciously stop in their play. I saw a little boy with his hoop stick pointed slanting toward the ground in the act of steering the hoop around the corner, and so he had stopped and was listening. The hoop was rolling away, doing its own steering. I saw a young girl prettily framed in an open window, a watering pot in her hand, and window boxes of red flowers under its spout, but the water had ceased to flow. The girl was listening. Everywhere were these impressive petrified forms, and everywhere was suspended movement and that awful stillness. The great artillery duel went on, each side hammering away with all its might, and it was splendid for smoke and noise, and most exulting to one's spirits. The poor little town around about us suffered cruelly. The cannonballs tore through its slight buildings, wrecking them as if they had been built of cards, and every moment or two one would see a huge rock come curving through the upper air above the smoke clouds and go plunging down through the roofs. Fire broke out, and columns of flame and smoke rose toward the sky. Presently the artillery concussions changed the weather. The sky became overcast, and a strong wind rose and blew away the smoke that hid the English fortresses. Then the spectacle was fine, turreted grey walls and towers, and streaming bright flags, and jets of red fire and gushes of white smoke in long rows, all standing out with sharp vividness against the deep leaden background of the sky. And then the whizzing missiles began to knock up the dirt all around us, and I felt no more interest in the scenery. There was one English gun that was getting our position down finer and finer all the time. Presently Joan pointed to it and said, "Fair Duke, step out of your tracks, or that machine will kill you." The Duke d'Alencon did as he was bid, but Monsieur de Lude rashly took his place, and that cannon tore his head off in a moment. "Now, to the assault," and the buglers blew the charge. Instantly we saw the body of men that had been appointed to the service move forward toward a point where the concentrated fire of our guns had crumbled the upper half of a broad stretch of wall to ruins. We saw this force descend into the ditch and begin to plant the scaling ladders. We were soon with them. The lieutenant general thought the assault premature, but Joan said, "Ah, gentle Duke, are you afraid? Do you not know that I have promised to send you home safe?" It was warm work in the ditches. The walls were crowded with men, and they poured avalanches of stones down upon us. There was one gigantic Englishman who did us more hurt than any dozen of his brethren. He always dominated the places easiest of assault, and flung down exceedingly troublesome big stones which smashed men and ladders both. Then he would near burst himself with laughing over what he had done. But the Duke settled accounts with him. He went and found the famous cannoneer, Jean Le Lorraine, and said, "Train your gun. Kill me this demon." He did it with the first shot. He hit the Englishman fair in the breast and knocked him backward into the city. The enemy's resistance was so effective and so stubborn that our people began to show signs of doubt and dismay. Seeing this, Joan raised her inspiring battle cry and descended into the fosse itself, the dwarf helping her and the paladin sticking bravely at her side with the standard. She started up a scaling ladder, but a great stone flung from above came crashing down upon her helmet and stretched her, wounded and stunned, upon the ground. But only for a moment. The dwarf stood her upon her feet, and straightway she started up the ladder again, crying, "To the assault, friends, to the assault, the English are ours. It is the appointed hour." There was a grand rush, and a fierce roar of war cries, and we swarmed over the ramparts like ants. The garrison fled. We pursued. Jargeau was ours. The Earl of Suffolk was hemmed in and surrounded, and the Duke d'Alencon and the Bastard of Orleans demanded that he surrender himself. But he was a proud nobleman and came of a proud race. He refused to yield his sword to subordinates, saying, "I will die rather. I will surrender to the Maid of Orleans alone, and to no other." His two brothers retreated, fighting step by step, toward the bridge, repressing their despairing forces and cutting them down by scores. Arrived on the bridge, the slaughter still continued. Alexander de la Pole was pushed overboard or fell over, and was drowned. 1,100 men had fallen. John de la Pole decided to give up the struggle, but he was nearly as proud and particular as his brother of Suffolk as to whom he would surrender to. The French officer nearest at hand was Guillaume Renaud, who was pressing him closely. Sir John said to him, "Are you a gentleman?" "Yes." "And a knight?" Then Sir John knighted him himself there on the bridge, giving him the accolade with English coolness and tranquility in the midst of that storm of slaughter and mutilation, and then bowing with high courtesy, took the sword by the blade and laid the hilt of it in the man's hand in token of surrender. Ah, yes, a proud tribe, those de la Poles. It was a grand day, a memorable day, a most splendid victory. We had a crowd of prisoners, but Joan would not allow them to be hurt. We took them with us and marched into Orleans next day through the usual tempest of welcome and joy. And this time there was a new tribute to our leader. From everywhere in the packed streets, the new recruits squeezed their way to the side to touch the sword of Joan of Arc and draw from it somewhat of that mysterious quality which made it invincible.